There is a small island in the Bay of Bengal where the same thing happens every single time someone gets too close. First, figures appear on the beach. Then the warnings come, arrows fired into the air or into the water just ahead of the approaching boat. And if you don't turn around, if you keep coming, the warnings stop. The arrows find their targets instead, every single time. No exceptions, no negotiations, no second chances. This has been happening for as long as anyone can remember. Colonial records, naval logs, satellite reports, news headlines from this decade. The pattern never changes. Someone approaches North Sentinel Island. The people who live there make it very clear that approach is a mistake, and the ones who ignore that message tend not to get the opportunity to ignore it twice. And here's what makes it genuinely one of the strangest situations on Earth right now. Not in history. Right now. Today. There is an island about the size of Manhattan, sitting inside the borders of a modern nation-state, governed by laws, covered by satellites, photographed from above in extraordinary detail, and yet the people living on it remain almost completely unknown to the outside world. We don't know their language. We don't know their population. We don't know what they call themselves. We don't even know exactly what they look like up close, because the few people who got close enough to find out mostly didn't survive the experience. Now, before we go any further, I want to be careful here, because this is a topic where the line between what we actually know and what we're assuming gets blurry very fast. There's a lot of mythology that's grown up around the Sentinelese. Some of it comes from genuine historical documentation. Some of it comes from speculation dressed up as fact. Some of it is just people projecting whatever story they wanted to tell onto people who have never been given a chance to tell their own. So throughout this, I'll try to be clear about the difference. When something is documented, we'll say so. When something is a theory, we'll say that too, because these are real people, and they deserve better than being turned into a legend. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment and tell me where you're from and what time it is there. Seriously, I read them. Last time I did this, there was someone in Jakarta at 2 a.m, someone in Edinburgh eating breakfast, someone in Sao Paulo stuck in traffic. The fact that you're all here at once from completely different corners of the planet is actually part of what makes this story so strange. Because the people we're talking about tonight have lived their entire lives on one island, cut off from all of it. No internet, no cities, no contact with the 8 billion people sharing this planet with them, and they appear to want it exactly that way. That's the part that's genuinely hard to wrap your head around. We live in a world where isolation is mostly accidental. People get cut off from the grid by disaster, by poverty, by geography. But the Sentinelese seem to have chosen this. Generation after generation, century after century, they have actively maintained their separation from the rest of humanity. Every time the outside world has reached toward them, they have pushed back, sometimes gently, sometimes lethally, but always consistently. That kind of sustained, deliberate rejection is almost without parallel in modern human history, and it raises questions that are genuinely hard to answer. Who are these people? Where did they come from? How long have they been on that island? What do they know about the world beyond their shore? Do they have any idea what's out there? And maybe the biggest question of all, why? Why the absolute refusal? Why the violence? Is it fear? Is it strategy? Is it something that happened to them that we don't know about? Those are the questions this video is going to try to answer. And I say try deliberately, because some of them don't have clean answers. Some of them may never have clean answers, which is itself part of the story. What we do know is this. There are people alive right now who have never seen a car, never heard recorded music, never encountered a written word, and they are living that life roughly 40 miles off the coast of a country with a space program. That gap between their world and ours is almost incomprehensible. It's not ancient history. It's not some distant chapter from a century ago. It's happening right now on an island that shows up on Google Maps, inside waters patrolled by the Indian Coast Guard. And the reason nobody is allowed to reach that shore isn't just about them keeping outsiders out. It's also about outsiders finally deciding that maybe, just maybe, some doors weren't meant to be opened. Here's how we got here. North Sentinel Island sits in the southern part of the Andaman archipelago, a chain of roughly 570 islands scattered across the Bay of Bengal like a broken spine running between India and Myanmar. Most people couldn't point to the Andamans on a map, which is itself part of why this story stayed quiet for so long. The islands are geographically remote, administratively peripheral, and historically easy to ignore if you weren't specifically looking for them. The archipelago as a whole is actually quite large. Stretch it out and it covers nearly 800 kilometres from north to south. Some of the islands are substantial, with towns and roads and ferry routes connecting them. Port Blair, the capital, has an airport and a prison that the British famously used to warehouse political dissidents during the colonial period. There are hotels, there are tourists. The Andamans, in other words, are not some forgotten corner of the globe in the way people sometimes imagine. North Sentinel, though, is different. It sits to the west of the main island chain, slightly separated from its neighbours, like something that drifted away from the group and never came back. It covers roughly 60 square kilometres, making it close to the size of Manhattan but shaped nothing like it. From the air it looks like a dark green oval ringed by white surf, the reef breaking constantly around its edges. The interior a dense and unbroken canopy of forest that tells you almost nothing about what's happening underneath it. That reef is the first thing anyone trying to reach the island notices, and it's not an accident that it matters so much. The coral shelf encircling North Sentinel is extensive and extremely shallow in places, which means large ships can't approach without grounding, and even smaller boats face serious navigational hazards. The number of spots where you could actually land something on that shore without it being a controlled disaster is quite limited. The island doesn't invite contact. The geography resists it before the people do. Add to that the forest itself. The interior is dense tropical growth that provides almost no visibility from outside, no clear paths, no obvious settlements you could spot from the water. Whoever lives in there is effectively invisible until they choose not to be. That's a defensive situation that any military strategist would recognise. High ground, concealment, controlled choke points, and an attacker who has to cross open water before reaching shore. This combination of geographic isolation and natural fortification helps explain why the island remained so comparatively obscure for such a long time. Colonial powers sailing these waters had plenty of other concerns. The broader Andamans were complicated enough. The British established a permanent settlement there in 1858, mainly to use the islands as a penal colony, and they encountered serious resistance from the indigenous Andamanese populations almost immediately. Managing that relationship consumed enormous administrative energy. North Sentinel, with its impossible reef and its people who showed no interest in being managed, could be conveniently set aside. And here it's worth slowing down for a moment, because there's a distinction that gets collapsed all the time and it matters. The Sentinelese are not the same as the other Andamanese peoples. The broader Andamanese groups, including the Ong, the Jarawa and the Great Andamanese, are separate populations with their own histories, their own languages, their own stories of contact and catastrophe with the outside world. Some of those contacts ended in cultural decimation. The Great Andamanese, who once numbered in the thousands, were reduced to a tiny remnant within decades of sustained colonial contact. That history is devastating and important. The Sentinelese are related to these groups in the broad sense that they likely share ancient roots, part of the same early human migrations that populated these islands tens of thousands of years ago. But they are not the same people. Their language, as far as anyone can tell, is not mutually intelligible with the other Andamanese tongues. Their behaviour has been entirely their own, which is part of why modern governments treat this particular piece of land differently than almost any other inhabited territory on the planet. India technically administers the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and North Sentinel falls within that jurisdiction. But the Indian government long ago arrived at a position that is genuinely unusual in international governance. The people there don't want contact. Forcing it has never worked, and so the default posture became, essentially, leave them alone, enforce a buffer zone, and let whatever is happening on that island continue to happen without interference. That decision came with the logic behind it. understanding that logic means understanding what happened every time someone tried the alternative. Here's the honest answer to the most obvious question. We don't really know who the Sentinelese are. Not in any deep sense. We know they exist. We know roughly where they live and approximately how many of them there might be. We know they use bows and arrows and spears, that they build outrigger canoes, that they maintain fires. Beyond that, almost everything becomes inference, educated guesswork, or projection. And understanding why we know so little is itself one of the most interesting things about them. Start with the basic demographics. Estimates of the Sentinelese population range enormously, from as few as 50 individuals to as many as 500, with most researchers settling on something like 50 to 150 as a working figure. That spread alone tells you how uncertain this is. The number most often cited in media coverage, around 50 to 400, is essentially the full range of plausible guesses derived from aerial observation, glimpses from research boats, and rough calculations about what a foraging population of this size island could realistically support. Nobody has counted. Nobody can count. The forest doesn't allow it. What aerial surveys have suggested is that the Sentinels don't live in a single large settlement. There appear to be multiple clusters of structures distributed across the island, which makes sense from a resource management perspective. A single concentrated population depending on one patch of forest would deplete it quickly. Spreading out across the island, moving between locations seasonally, keeps any one area from being exhausted. This matches what we see in comparable hunter-gatherer populations elsewhere. Small, mobile or semi-mobile groups, using the landscape intelligently rather than trying to dominate it. The structures themselves, what can be observed from a safe distance, appear to be relatively simple shelters, not permanent constructions in the way that word implies permanence in an urban context, but deliberately built, maintained, and apparently rebuilt in predictable locations. There are fire sites, there is evidence of organised activity along the shoreline. The Sentinelese are clearly not randomly distributed across their island. There's structure to how they use the space. We just can't get close enough to understand what that structure means. Their material toolkit, again observed from distance and inferred from what they've thrown at boats, includes bows capable of remarkable range and accuracy, iron-tipped spears, and a type of narrow outrigger canoe suited to navigating inside the reef rather than crossing open ocean. That last detail is important. Their boats are designed for the lagoon, not for long-distance travel. Whatever they know of the world beyond their reef, they're not actively exploring it. The canoe design suggests they've optimized for their own territory, not for leaving it. Now here's where things get genuinely difficult. Language, belief systems, social structure, kinship organization, ritual practice, oral tradition, all of the things that make a culture what it is rather than just a population inhabiting a space. On all of that we have essentially nothing. The Sentinelese language has never been recorded in any usable way. The closest Andamanese languages, spoken by the Onganjarawa, offer no confirmed window into it. Linguists have noted that even the related Andamanese languages diverge significantly from each other over long periods of isolation, and the Sentinelese have been isolated longer and more completely than any of the others. Whether their language is recognisably related to those spoken by neighbouring island groups, nobody knows. It's never been possible to get close enough, long enough, and safely enough to find out. The same applies to everything downstream of language: social hierarchy or the absence of it, marriage practices, funerary traditions, cosmology. Do they have stories about where they came from? About the ocean? About the lights they might sometimes see on the horizon from passing ships? We have no idea. Projecting any particular belief system onto them based on what other isolated populations believe would be precisely the kind of assumption that makes anthropologists wince, which brings up the timeline question. Because this is where popular accounts tend to get loose with language in ways that matter. The claim you see most often is that the Sentinelese have lived on North Sentinel for 60,000 years, sometimes stated as flatly as if it were a confirmed historical record. The actual situation is considerably more complicated and more interesting for being so. What the genetic and archaeological evidence suggests is that humans reached the Andaman Islands as part of an early dispersal out of Africa that moved along coastlines through South Asia and into Southeast Asia. The timing of that dispersal is genuinely debated, but estimates in the range of 50,000 to 70,000 years ago are widely cited, with some researchers arguing for earlier dates. The indigenous Andamanese populations as a group appear to descend from these ancient migrations. Their genetic signatures are ancient. They branched early. They've been here for a very long time. But saying that people have been on the Andaman Islands for something in the range of tens of thousands of years is not the same as saying the Sentinelese specifically have been on North Sentinel for 60,000 years as a continuous, unbroken, genetically and culturally identical community. Population histories are messy. Groups move. Islands get repopulated. Catastrophes happen and are recovered from. The archaeological record for North Sentinel specifically is non-existent because nobody has been able to conduct archaeological work there. The 60,000-year figure is an extrapolation from the broader Andamanese picture, not a documented fact about this particular island and these particular people. It might be right, it might be in the right ballpark, but treating it as established fact flattens a lot of genuine uncertainty. What we can say is that the Sentinelese appear to represent one of the oldest continuous human presences in the broader region. The genetic evidence from related Andamanese groups shows they diverge from the rest of humanity's family tree very early, and the isolation has been profound enough, long enough, to produce people who are linguistically and culturally distinct from everyone around them. That's the meaningful truth underneath the headline number. Whether it's 40,000 years or 60,000 years or something else, the depth of time involved is real, and that depth of time is itself the thing that shapes the Sentinelese identity in ways that can't be overstated. Every generation alive on that island learned the world from the generation before. The skills, the territory, the dangers, the resources, the ways of reading weather and tides and animal behaviour, all of it transmitted through direct human relationship, without writing, without outside input, refined and adjusted over an almost incomprehensible span of time. Whatever they know about their island, they know extraordinarily well. Whatever they believe about the world beyond it, those beliefs were formed without any outside correction or contamination for longer than most civilizations have existed. It would be easy at this point to romanticize that, to describe the Sentinelese as noble or pure, or living in some kind of prelapsarian state that the rest of humanity lost. That would be wrong. They're people, complex, capable, political, in whatever ways small communities are always political, subject to illness and conflict and loss, and whatever passes for joy or grief in their world. The isolation doesn't make them simpler than us. It makes them different from us in ways we genuinely cannot measure. It also doesn't make them static. 60,000 years or 40,000 years or however long they've been there, that's not stasis. That's an enormous amount of time for a culture to change, adapt, respond, and evolve in ways that leave no trace we can read. The Sentinelese we might glimpse today from the deck of a research vessel are not frozen in amber. They're the current version of something that has been continuously becoming itself for longer than agriculture has existed anywhere on Earth. What we don't know about them is vast. What we can infer is fragmentary. And the first people outside their island to even try to record what they saw were working from nothing, making it up as they went and usually getting it wrong. When outside observers finally do stumble into this story, they don't arrive with notebooks and careful methodologies. They arrive wet, hungry, lost, and usually annoyed that the world is not behaving according to their maps. For a long time, North Sentinel wasn't North Sentinel. It was just one more dark mass on the horizon in a sea full of dark masses. Early sailors in the Bay of Bengal were mostly interested in staying alive, catching the monsoon at the right angle, avoiding reefs, finding fresh water before the barrels ran dry. The Andamans, taken as a whole, had a reputation that shows up again and again in scattered logbooks and imperial reports: dangerous shoals, unpredictable currents, and savage islanders. That last phrase is the key, because it tells you more about the writers than the people they were talking about. We don't have a first clear-named discovery moment for the Sentinelese. What we have is something fuzzier. Centuries of ships passing through the Andaman Sea and occasionally noticing that some of the smaller islands seemed taken. Smoke columns, canoes, human figures on the beach, arrows. Some of the earliest European accounts of the region don't even try to distinguish one Andamanese group from another. To a Portuguese captain blown off course in the 1500s, or an East India Company officer limping through the archipelago in the 1700s with a damaged hull, everyone he glimpsed on those shores was just the Andamaners, or the natives, or the blacks of these islands. If one landing party got attacked on one shoreline, that story could, and did, become a story about all of them. You can see how this works in the language of the time. Reports refer to a race of cannibals, to most ferocious and treacherous islanders, to inhospitable shores infested by savages. No ethnography, no distinction between Great Andaman, Little Andaman, or a difficult little reef-guarded island we now call North Sentinel. Very few direct observations at all, just rumour layered on rumour, hardened by repetition into something that felt like fact. And underneath the language, the basic situation is simple. A wooden ship in the age of sail is a fragile ecosystem. You have finite food, finite fresh water, and a crew living at the edge of nutritional and medical disaster. Scurvy, dysentery, malnutrition. When you sight land in a region like the Andamans, you don't think, let us gently observe these cultures. You think, if we don't get water in the next 48 hours, people start dying. So boats are lowered. Men row toward a beach they know nothing about, sometimes armed, sometimes not, sometimes waving cloth or shiny objects as peace tokens, sometimes just marching straight for the tree line like they own the place. On the other side of the surf, people who have their own history with passing strangers, maybe their own long memory of abductions, raids, or simple theft, see unknown men approaching, carrying metal and noise and the possibility of catastrophe. If arrows fly at that point, we should not be surprised. A lot of the first sightings we can reconstruct for North Sentinel itself are like this: brief, tense, and largely one-sided in the telling. A ship notes an island with a dangerous reef. A longboat goes in to sound the depth or look for a freshwater stream. Figures appear on the beach. A few arrows are loosed. The boat turns around. The island is afterward marked on charts with some version of inhabited by hostile natives. Hostile to whom, exactly, is never the question. From a modern perspective, those early descriptions are riddled with problems. They almost never distinguish between groups. They conflate what happened on one island with what might happen on any island. They treat the reaction of local people as an unprovoked attack, while the act of rowing up to someone else's shore armed without invitation is classified as simple exploration. They are, in other words, not neutral documents. They're the paperwork of empire and commerce. That doesn't mean everything in them is useless. It just means we have to read them sideways. When a logbook from a merchant vessel notes dark-skinned men armed with bows appearing in numbers on the beach, making violent gestures preventing our landing, we can reasonably infer that there were indeed people there, that they had bows, that they were organised enough to present a unified front at short notice. When another report says that sailors approaching a small low island in the Andamans were greeted by a shower of arrows which fell with great force upon the water around our boat, we can take seriously the idea that whoever was on that island was highly motivated to keep outsiders at a distance. But when the same reports leap from arrows were shot to these people are bloodthirsty and irredeemable savages, that's not data. That's 18th and 19th century racism doing what it always did, constructing an enemy out of the unknown. There's another wrinkle. Very often the person writing the report wasn't even in the boat. The captain stays aboard. The first mate leads the shore party. The captain later writes up the event based on what the mate says, which is based on what the men in the front of the boat shouted when they saw figures moving in the trees. Add fear, pride, humiliation at being turned back by a group perceived as inferior, and suddenly the story has teeth and horns it didn't start with. Then that report gets copied, summarised, and quoted. A British official in Calcutta compiling a regional description might never have come within 500 kilometres of North Sentinel, but he has seen the phrase "ferocious islanders" in 3 different dispatches, and so he repeats it in his own. A later visitor reads that description, lands elsewhere in the Andamans, has a nervous encounter with a different group entirely, and because he already believes the people here are ferocious, he reads every ambiguous gesture as a threat. Second-hand accounts like this don't just describe reality, they shape it. If your starting point is, "These islanders are dangerous," you approach with your nerves on fire and your finger on the trigger. If instead your starting point is, "We are strangers in their territory," you see the same drawn bowstring and interpret it as a warning shot, not a declaration of war. From the islanders' perspective, the outsider's motives are opaque. A ship appears where yesterday there was only reef and waves. Men disembark. They move with the purposeful, territorial body language that humans everywhere recognize. They head for water sources. They poke around, cutting wood, taking coconuts. They treat the place as if no one lives there. Whatever the Sentinelese call themselves, whatever categories they use to think about us and not us, it's hard to imagine that this behavior would read as anything but threatening. An unknown group walking into your larder and your sacred sites, equipped with strange tools and no apparent ability to understand your shouted commands, is the beginning of a very bad story. That's how misunderstanding and fear escalate in first contact situations. Nobody wakes up thinking, "Today I will create a myth about a hostile tribe that will last for centuries." Instead, small, tense encounters accumulate. A few sailors are wounded or killed on one voyage. Years later, a different crew, hearing those stories, fires a warning shot when canoes appear. Someone on the beach is hit. The survivors carry that memory. The next time they see a foreign boat, they don't wait. They shoot first. Violence can easily be the visible tip of what is actually a long, slow conversation, carried out in signals neither side fully reads. A group on shore might begin with what, in their own cultural vocabulary, is a clear warning display. Assembling in numbers, shouting, brandishing weapons, firing arrows short of the target, aiming for the sand near the intruders rather than their bodies. To them this says, "You're not welcome, go away." To men in a rowboat who have been primed by earlier rumours to expect bloodthirsty savages, it looks exactly like an attempted ambush. They turn tail and row back to the ship, or they fire in response. Either way, the interaction ends not in mutual understanding, but in a simple, memorable story. They attacked us. Over time, those moments harden into a recognizable pattern, especially around islands like North Sentinel. You can outline it in a few steps. Step 1. Approach. A ship needs something. Fresh water, food, timber, a safer anchorage out of a storm, or simply information about currents and channels. Or in later periods, officials and surveyors want something bigger. Charts, claims, control over the sea lanes for an expanding empire that doesn't like blank spots on the map. Step 2. Display of warning. People on the island have no reason to assume that these strangers mean well. If anything, later historical context suggests they had very good reasons to assume the opposite. So they gather at the shoreline, they show themselves, they notch arrows, brandish spears, shout, perhaps dance or gesture in ways meant to be clearly intimidating. They might even permit a certain distance up to the edge of the reef to be crossed before drawing a hard line. Step 3. Retreat or violence. The outsiders interpret that warning through their own filters. If they're cautious or undermanned, they might decide that whatever water or wood they hope to get isn't worth the risk. They leave, muttering about intractable savages. If they're determined, armed, and invested in their own right to be there, because they're on imperial business, or because their charts show this as unclaimed land, they might respond with force, a volley of musket fire, a kidnapping to obtain specimens or interpreters, a punitive raid for the loss of a few sailors' lives. From the very beginning, Everything around North Sentinel suggests that this three-step cycle has been in play. Visitors approach. Sentinelese appear with weapons visibly ready. The visitors either back away or push forward into some kind of conflict. Then the story travels back out into the world shorn of context. Those islanders kill anyone who comes near. Notice what's missing from that formula. Any acknowledgement that from the Sentinelese point of view, it's the outsiders who are repeating a pattern of intrusion, of attempted exploitation, of potential disease, of unknown dangers following in the wake of every anchored hull. By the time the British Empire begins to take a serious interest in the Andamans as a penal colony site, this rumour cloud is already hanging over the entire region. Maps show North Sentinel with labels like "inhabited by hostile tribes." Officers tasked with investigation arrive already armed with a narrative that the people here are a problem to be solved, not neighbours to be approached carefully or left alone entirely. And once that narrative is in place, it doesn't take much to keep it alive. One arrow shot from a beach becomes proof. One attempt to land that ends in a flurry of projectiles is folded neatly into a pre-existing story that was written centuries earlier by anonymous sailors under very different circumstances. The truth, as far as we can glimpse it, is both simpler and more unsettling. North Sentinel is a shore whose people have consistently said no. From the first distant canoes rowing out from leaking hulls to the modern steel research vessel holding station just outside bow range, the pattern repeats: approach, warning, retreat, or blood. The details change. Cloth sails become diesel engines, wooden spears become iron-tipped arrows, but the core dynamic remains. The next phase in the story is what happens when a state power decides that no is not an acceptable answer and sets out to force a different one. When the British arrive as more than passing specks on the horizon, they don't come as shipwreck stragglers. They come as a system. By the mid-1800s, the Andamans had gone from being those dangerous islands you try to sail around to a strategic asset in the Bay of Bengal. The East India Company and then the British Crown wanted secure sea lanes between India and Southeast Asia. Steamships needed coal depots. The Empire needed telegraph cables, safe anchorages, and places to put people it didn't want in its cities. Blank spots on the map are fine for lost mariners. They are unacceptable for an imperial bureaucracy, so the Andamans are reimagined. Not as someone's home, but as a resource, a potential penal colony, a naval station, a set of coordinates to be surveyed, charted, and pacified. In 1858, after the Indian Rebellion, the British begin building a penal settlement on South Andaman. From then on, officials, surveyors, and naval officers are not just passing through. They're staying, and they want to know exactly who and what is around them. That's the context in which North Sentinel shifts from a rumour-clouded island on the edge of the charts to an explicit problem. We have a fairly clear paper trail for the British presence in the Andamans as a whole. Official correspondence, survey reports, medical notes from the penal colonies, ethnographic sketches of great Andamanese groups. What we don't have is a neat, continuous, objective record specifically about the Sentinelese. Instead, they flicker in and out of view whenever an official decides that this particular uncooperative island needs to be investigated. The mindset is consistent. The people on these islands are not seen as sovereign communities. They're obstacles to be managed, catalogued, or removed from areas the British want to use. That logic shapes the contact strategies. On the larger Andaman Islands, the British approach is a mix of violence, kidnapping, and something they call conciliatory measures that would today be labelled coercive contact. One of the most influential figures here is Maurice Vidal Portman, an officer put in charge of the Andamanese tribal administration in the late 19th century. Portman is methodical, ambitious, and deeply steeped in the racial science of his day. He's tasked with managing indigenous groups to make the island safer for the penal colony and for British operations. The methods he and his colleagues use set the pattern. On Great Andaman, where there are multiple distinct groups, British parties go inland armed. They conduct what they call expeditions to punish raids, to seize hostages, or to establish friendship. They fire guns to scatter resisting groups. They burn villages. They remove skulls and bones for study. They also take living people, men, women and children, back to the settlement. The logic is disturbingly simple. If you can't speak to the people out in the bush, bring some of them to you. Study them. clothe them, feed them, try to teach them a little Hindustani or English, then send them back to their home territories loaded with gifts, coconuts, cloth, metal tools, in the hope that they will tell their kin, "The white men at Port Blair are powerful, but friendly, and we should not attack them." On paper, this is called pacification or conciliatory strategy. In practice, it is abduction dressed up as science and benevolence. We know from contemporary medical notes and later demographic studies what happened to many of the people subjected to this process on Great Andaman. They died, not immediately and not always violently. They died of measles, of influenza, of respiratory infections, of diseases that swept through crowded penal settlements and naval stations, but had been absent from the forest villages for thousands of years. Their immune systems had never seen these pathogens. They had no previous exposure, no inherited antibodies, no cultural knowledge of how to limit spread. Officials noticed this. They commented on how the wild tribes sickened and died in disproportionate numbers when brought into close contact with convicts and guards. But the same pattern continued, because the administrative goal wasn't indigenous health, it was control. This broader context matters when we zoom in on North Sentinel, because the famous story people like to tell, the one about the British kidnapping Sentinelese, doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not a bizarre one-off, it's the extension of a technique already being used nearby. The best-known episode occurs in 1880. We have Portman's own report describing it, and we also have later retellings that run quite a bit ahead of the sparse original details. According to Portman, he organises an expedition to North Sentinel with both armed guards and Andamanese people from other groups as intermediaries. The party lands, moves inland, and finds signs of habitation, paths, huts, abandoned fires. They do not at first find the inhabitants themselves. It seems likely the Sentinelese withdrew into the forest when they saw or heard the landing. Portman writes that his party eventually comes across a small group, an elderly couple and several children. The adults appear to be unable to flee quickly. The children, for reasons we can only guess at, are taken along as Portman's party withdraws. The old couple are also brought to the boat. This is where the documented record and later legend begin to diverge. Portman says the captured Sentinelese were taken to the main settlement at Port Blair, given clothing and food, and well treated. Within days, the elderly man and woman became severely ill, almost certainly from exposure to diseases circulating in the penal colony. They died soon afterwards. The children, now effectively orphans in a place that must have been alien in every sense, also sickened. According to Portman's account, when they began to recover, they were taken back to North Sentinel and returned to the shoreline with gifts. That is the core of what is reasonably well documented. A British officer leads an armed expedition, finds a vulnerable group, takes them away without consent, the adults die, the children fall ill, then some of the survivors are returned with presents as a kind of human message in a bottle. Tell your people we mean well. Later tellings of this episode, especially in newspaper articles and popular books, often add vivid details we cannot actually verify from contemporary sources. You'll see claims that all the captured children died, or that the returning party watched Sentinelese relatives fleeing in terror at the sight of their altered kin, or that this specific expedition explains all subsequent hostility. These versions make for a sharp moral parable. They are not all equally well grounded in the 19th century documents. What we can say with some confidence is this. First, the abduction happened. British officers landed on North Sentinel, took people who had not invited them, and removed them to a disease-ridden penal colony bloated with outsiders. Second, there was serious illness and death. It would be astonishing if there weren't. Everywhere in the world where isolated communities are suddenly exposed to the microbial cloud of empire, the same pattern appears. Respiratory diseases and childhood illnesses that are mild in big genetically mixed populations become lethal in small isolated ones. Third, the British saw this as a manageable cost of doing business. Portman's tone is clinical. even when describing the deaths. There is no indication that the episode stopped similar contact experiments elsewhere in the archipelago. Fourth, some survivors were almost certainly returned, bearing physical evidence of what had been done to them, scars, new clothing, stories and memories we will never hear in their own words. Now consider what such an event might look like from the inside of a community like the Sentinelese. You're living on an island that has, for generations, responded to distant ships and strange boats with warnings and arrows. This strategy has worked. Outsiders land rarely, and when they do, they often leave quickly. Then, one day, a large disciplined party comes not just to the beach, but into the interior. They move with confidence, guns over their shoulders. They find your elders, the fragile core of your collective memory, and children who have not yet learned how the world works. They take them. Some of them never come back. The ones who do return are different. Maybe they cough. Maybe they bring back an infection that spreads through the camp. Maybe they carry metal tools or cloth, tangible reminders of the people who ripped their family apart. Even if the return is, on its surface, peaceful, no shots fired on the beach, no immediate violence, the underlying message is clear. These strangers can reach into your most protected spaces, and when they do, people die. We cannot trace step by step how that episode was remembered or incorporated into Sentinelese culture. We don't know their language, we have no oral histories, but we don't have to romanticize or speculate wildly to see how an event like that, in a small, tightly knit community, could harden an already cautious stance into something close to absolute refusal. There's also the biology. Once you've had a traumatic epidemic caused by contact, you don't need germ theory to notice the pattern. You just need correlation. Strangers appear, people start coughing, elders die. Over time, the simplest protective rule emerges: don't let strangers land. This is where disease risk and trauma fuse into a single, powerful logic. Even if not every outsider is a kidnapper, even if some expeditions come with gifts and smiles, you can't separate them cleanly in memory from the ones that brought death. It is safer, from a purely survival-oriented perspective, to treat all of them as the same threat. For the British, though, the lesson of Portman's expedition is not, we should leave these people alone. It's this group is very shy and difficult to approach, and further attempts at conciliation may be necessary. That language appears in official reports. The framework never shifts from they are a problem to be solved. This mismatch in interpretation is crucial. On one side, the Sentinelers may have experienced the late 19th century as an era when the horizons suddenly grew teeth. Steamships, rifles, kidnapping parties, death in the wake of contact. On the other side, British administrators file it away as a disappointing but not decisive attempt at engagement. Later, when people describe North Sentinel as implacably hostile or uniquely violent, they often point back, explicitly or implicitly, to that 1880 episode as the moment the island learned to hate outsiders. That's a tidy story. It might be partially true. It also slides quietly past two important facts. First, the Sentinelese were already resisting landings before Portman ever set foot on their beach. Earlier logs mention arrows and armed defenders. Hostility did not spring fully formed from one kidnapping. It likely has deeper roots, perhaps going back to contacts with Asian seafarers or other island groups long before any British charted these reefs. Second, the British were not only interacting with Sentinelese in this way. The same pattern, armed landings, abductions, epidemic disease, was playing out among other Andamanese communities. The difference is that those other groups, over time, were broken terribly by the combined forces of disease, land loss, and direct violence. Their populations crashed. Their capacity to maintain isolation was eroded. On North Sentinel, by contrast, the pattern seems to have produced the opposite outcome, a hardened perimeter. If anything, Portman's experiment likely confirmed a pre-existing rule: strangers are catastrophic. Keep them off the island. We should be careful not to treat that one 19th century expedition as the single turning point in a 60,000-year story. But it's fair to say it became a kind of cautionary tale, first for the Sentinelese, in whatever form they told it to each other, and much later for the outside world. By the late 20th century, anthropologists and administrators studying the Andamans were acutely aware of how colonial contact had decimated other groups. When they dug back into the archives, Portman's account and similar reports were no longer read as dry curiosities. They were warnings, evidence that even minimal, clumsy contact could be lethal. At the same time, in popular culture and journalism, the same episode was being retold with a different emphasis, turning the Sentinelese into a symbol of righteous fury. The tribe that killed because the British kidnapped their grandparents. That framing is emotionally satisfying, but it blurs the line between documentation and legend. The reality, as usual, is messier. We have enough evidence to see how coercive British methods, disease and trauma could set the stage for a century of deliberate defensive aggression from the island. We do not have enough to claim that every arrow ever fired from a North Sentinel beach is a conscious echo of Portman's name. What we can see clearly is the pattern. Imperial power decides that no is not an acceptable answer. It forces contact. People die. The survivors learn in the most brutal way possible that distance is safety. And that pattern doesn't end with the Victorian era. It just changes shape. In the 20th century, governments, anthropologists and adventurers keep coming back to the reef line around North Sentinel, each with their own reasons to close the gap. The island's response, over and over, is the same old answer, sharpened by history. Stay away. By the time the 20th century really gets going, the Andamans have shifted from a raw imperial outpost to a more settled colonial asset, and eventually into part of an independent India. The labels on the maps change, the uniforms on the ships change, but if you zoom in on that tiny square labelled North Sentinel, the script is strangely repetitive. Someone decides they need to see what's there. They move closer. The island says no. In the early decades, the contacts are sporadic and poorly documented. You have passing steamers, survey vessels, occasional naval patrols. The pattern that shows up in logs is familiar. A ship comes within visual range. Someone spots people on the beach, and almost immediately there are men with bows, sometimes women and children behind them, watching, shouting, brandishing weapons. Sometimes the ships don't stop, sometimes they do. When they do stop, the first move from the outsiders is often framed as peaceful. Lower a boat, bring some sailors or police or officials in khaki to parley. In their minds they're approaching cautiously, maybe even respectfully. In Sentinelese terms, this is a direct incursion into the danger zone. We don't know the exact distance at which the Sentinelese draw the mental line. Too close. But from the accounts we have, it's not contact distance. It's not handshake or even shouting range. It's much further out. A boat that leaves the main ship and starts heading for the shallows crosses an invisible threshold. And once that line is crossed, the response is almost mechanical. Archers walk down to the surf. Men spread out along the beach. They form what looks to outside observers like a thin, irregular shield. Sometimes they don't shoot immediately. There is a phase that shows up in multiple 20th century reports, a warning period. Arrows held at the ready, bows drawn but angled slightly aside. Gestures that observers describe as waving or gesticulating, shouting words we couldn't understand. It's not random. It's a graduated response. As long as the intruders stay far enough out, the island's answer is display. Here we are, armed, watching, not running. Come closer, and it changes. When a boat pushes further in, over and over the same thing happens. The archers tighten formation. Some take cover behind low scrub or in the shadow of the trees. One or two step in front in full view and knock arrows. Then the first shot goes out, not necessarily at a person, but across the bow, into the water, or into the hull of the boat if it's close enough. A tracer line carved into the sea that says, "This is the last warning you get." This isn't the chaotic violence people sometimes imagine when they hear hostile tribe. It looks from the outside like a very clear perimeter defense doctrine. Visible presence, warning, escalation. And every decade that passes gives the Sentinels more reasons to stick to it. By mid-century, we're not just talking about sailing ships and rowing boats anymore. The technology at the horizon has changed. The soundscape around the island changes with it. In the age of sail, a ship appears slowly, days or hours from first sighting to beach. The Sentinelese can watch the strange shape creeping across the horizon, see if it turns away, judge the wind, decide whether to stand ready or fade back into the forest. There is time. Then engines arrive, first on bigger ships, then on smaller boats, and finally in the sky. A diesel launch can cross from open water to the reef in minutes. There's no long warning period where men on the shore can gauge intent from far away. By the time you hear the engine distinctly, the boat is already committed to the approach. That compresses the decision window on the beach. There's less space for that old calculus of maybe they'll drift past, maybe they'll anchor far out, maybe we can vanish into the trees and let this one go. With motorboats, almost every approach is decisive. You don't drift casually onto a reef with a throbbing engine. You drive there on purpose. That makes each appearance scarier, more intrusive, more likely to trigger an immediate hard response. Then come helicopters. From the Sentinelese point of view, these must have been nightmarish. A thing louder than any thunder they've heard, low and vibrating, able to hover above the exact places that used to be safe, the line of trees, the interior clearings, the places where you could vanish from the sight of a ship's mast. In the 1970s, 80s and 90s, Indian government and anthropological parties use helicopters to overfly North Sentinel, to take photos, to assess the population from the air. Sometimes they drop sacks of coconuts or other gifts from a low hover. Sometimes they land on the reef or in the very shallows, rotor wash flattening the scrub, blowing sand into the faces of the people on shore. From the pilot's perspective, this is an efficient survey operation. Get in, don't touch the forest, don't leave footprints. From the island's perspective, it's something else entirely. The sky itself is penetrable. The safe retreat into the interior is no longer guaranteed. A machine that roars like a demon can appear without warning and hover over you, shedding objects and breaking every rule of how the world is supposed to work. If you've already learned that contact equals kidnapping and disease, what does that do to your mental map of safety? The archers adapt as best they can. There are accounts of Sentinelese men on the beach, drawing and firing arrows at low-hovering helicopters. They cannot possibly hit the rotors. The arrows fall back into the surf. But from a behavioural point of view, it doesn't matter. The same logic is being applied. Here is an intruder coming too close. Here is the tool we have. We will use it. And the message is received. Photographs from those overflights show men with bows, women and children watching from the tree line, sometimes a single man stepping forward, arrow drawn, aimed squarely at the floating machine. The island has no way to stop a helicopter. What it can do is send the clearest possible signal. This too is inside our no-go zone. Parallel to the shift in technology is a shift in how outsiders think about their own actions. Especially in the second half of the 20th century, the rhetoric changes. Governments and anthropologists increasingly frame their visits as peaceful contact, friendship missions, gift-giving tours. Instead of muskets and chains, they bring coconuts, pots, knives, bits of cloth. They come with intentions they insist are benign. But from the receiving end, intention is almost irrelevant. You don't need to know why strangers are closing in. You only need to know what tends to happen when they do. Imagine you're standing on that beach, bow in hand. A boat is coming. The people in it are waving. They're not firing guns. They're holding up bright objects, shouting words you don't recognize. Are those gifts? Are they bait? What if the last time such a boat came, people were taken? What if the time before that a disease followed? What if, going even further back, some group of outsiders raided your shore, or another island's shore, and left bodies behind? You don't need a written history for that to be encoded in story, in taboo, in a rule that feels as solid as a law of physics. Do not let them close. Even peaceful gifts can carry threat in 3 different ways. First, there's the obvious one, physical risk. To receive a gift, you have to shorten the distance. You have to walk into spear range of men whose capabilities you don't understand. You have to put your hands on objects that might cut, burn, entangle. If you're a small island group, you can't afford many mistakes. Second, there is the invisible risk, disease. The Sentinels don't know about viruses or bacteria in the abstract, but they absolutely can know that things from outside sometimes come wrapped in sickness. Cloth can carry lice or scabies. Metal tools can carry smears of blood or mucus. Food can be the vector for parasites, for stomach bugs that rip through a closely knit camp. When anthropological teams toss sacks of coconuts into the shallows and then back away, to them it's a clever compromise. We get to offer gifts from a safe distance. To the Sentinelese it might look like this. The strangers come close enough that their breath and skin and clothes are near the water we wade in. Then they leave objects we don't control, infused with their unknown smell and touch, right where our children play. Third, there's the social risk. Accepting something creates a relationship. In many small-scale societies, gifts are not neutral. They can imply obligation, alliance, hierarchy. Taking what an outsider offers might, in your own terms, entangle you in a relationship you don't want, one where they believe they now have the right to return, to demand something, to claim a kind of patronage over your group. So when, during 20th century expeditions, the Sentinelese sometimes ignore or discard gifts, or rush out to grab coconuts and then immediately retreat into the trees without trying to interact, that may not be shyness in the way outsiders imagine it. It may be a carefully calibrated extraction. Obtain the resource, maintain the wall, and whenever gift-givers misread that caution as an opening for deeper approach, the island snaps the perimeter shut again. More arrows, more shouting, more explicit refusal. On the other side of the reef, distrust hardens too. Each time a boat goes in and comes back with a shaft sticking from its hull, or a crewman with a superficial wound, the story filters through naval mess halls, administrative offices, and press reports. The language settles into a cliché. They drive us away. They attack without provocation. They reject all attempts at friendship. The earlier context, the kidnapping, the epidemics, the long arch of colonial disruption, fades conveniently into the background. What stands out to officials planning patrols or anthropologists advocating contact policies is the immediacy of the repulsion. We went there last year, they shot at us. We went back, they shot again. Therefore, they are implacably hostile. Distrust on the Sentinelese side is rooted in survival logic and lived memory. Distrust on the outsider side is rooted in wounded pride and fear of the unknown. Each failed approach reinforces both. When the islanders fire on a police launch, the police log it as aggression and approach the next time with more caution, more weapons, more readiness to interpret any movement on the beach as a threat. When a helicopter hovers low and men on the beach shoot futile arrows at it, the pilot and passengers come away with a story about violent primitives attacking modern technology. The next overflight is conducted higher, faster, with a greater sense that the people below are not partners but potential enemies. Even the so-called successful gift-dropping missions in the late 20th century, where Sentinelese come out, take coconuts, do not immediately fire and nobody gets hurt, carry this double edge. For some Indian officials and anthropologists, these episodes become proof that friendly contact is possible, that the islanders are softening. That interpretation fuels new missions, new attempts to get closer, to step beyond the line that has, for the Sentinelese, become non-negotiable. For the islanders, those same days might be filed away differently. A rare moment when the outsiders came but did not push further. A reminder that you can sometimes extract resources from them without letting them land. And underneath that, the rule stays the same. Don't trust them, don't relax. If they cross the line, shoot. The 20th century, in other words, doesn't produce a single dramatic confrontation that explains everything. It produces a steady drumbeat of approaches and rebuffs. Boats in, arrows out, helicopters over, arrows up, gifts dropped, people advance just far enough to grab them, then retreat with bows still in hand. From a distance it looks repetitive, almost monotonous. Up close, each encounter is another data point in a feedback loop of mutual suspicion. For the Sentinelese, every approach that ends with them still in control of their beach, still able to push strangers back into their boats, is a validation of the defense strategy. The old rule holds: distance is safety, and violence at the boundary, measured, focused, not indiscriminate, is the tool that maintains that distance. For the outsiders, every approach that ends with arrows and refusal is a reminder that this pocket of the world does not respond to the usual levers. flags, proclamations, administrative orders, even gifts. That makes North Sentinel not just a cartographic anomaly, but a psychological one, a place that resists being folded completely into the modern order. And that unresolved tension sets the scene for the near misses and strange almost encounters that follow when a few individuals come closer to bridging the gap than anyone had in generations. And still, somehow, the island holds its line. There is a strange category of stories that starts to appear in the records from the 1970s onward. They're not about ships driven off at long range or helicopters pelted helplessly with arrows. They're about something that, at first glance, looks almost like negotiation. Indian anthropologists like T.N. Pandit begin making what they call contact expeditions. The idea is simple in outline and incredibly complicated in practice. Approach slowly in a small boat, stop before the danger line, put out gifts, and see what happens. No armed soldiers storming the beach, no chains, just coconuts, metal tools, sometimes a plastic bucket or a doll, floating in the shallows or left on the sand. From the reports, a pattern emerges. The boats nose in toward the reef, engines cut, men paddling the last few meters. On shore, Sentinelese figures appear at the tree line. Bows are visible, arrows held. There is shouting, gesturing, sometimes what looks to the visitors like a mixture of threat and curiosity. The outsiders stay in the water or stand half in, half out of the boat, holding out the gifts. Then they retreat a little, waiting. Sometimes nothing happens. The people on shore remain where they are, watching. The gifts float in the surf or sit on the sand untouched as the boat drifts or pulls back. After a while, the visitors give up and leave, logging it as another failure. Other times the stalemate breaks. A few Sentinelese men step out from the line of scrub and walk down the beach. They do not lower their bows. They move quickly, grab the coconuts or the metal tools, and then turn and sprint back toward the trees. In some accounts, a man bends over to snatch a gift while another stands behind him, arrow drawn, covering him. It looks exactly like what it is, a tactical extraction under threat. From the boat, this scene is intoxicating. To the anthropologist soaked in theories of first contact, that moment, objects taken, no arrows loosed, is charged with meaning. It feels like the ice is breaking. It feels like the beginning of relationship. But what does it mean on the beach? We don't know. We can't know, not with any confidence. Every interpretation is a projection, a guess across a gulf of language, culture, and radically different histories of what strangers on the shore means. One anthropologist might write in his field notes, "They are becoming accustomed to our presence. Hostility is giving way to cautious acceptance." Another observer, reading the same description, might see something else. They are refining a strategy to strip resources without allowing intrusion. The behavior itself, approach, snatch, retreat, is compatible with both stories. That's the problem of reading minds from a boat. It isn't just the taking of gifts that generates these ambiguous tales. There are moments when Sentinelese people do things that, to outsiders, look almost like deliberate communication. On one well-documented visit in the early 1990s, a government team approaches with coconuts. A handful of Sentinelese appear on the shore, men first, then a few women and children. The men carry bows but don't shoot. The visitors toss the coconuts into the shallows, then hold up more, gesturing. The islanders wade out, pick the fruits from the water, carry them back and crack them open right there, drinking the sweet liquid, eating the flesh. This repeats: toss, retrieve, retreat. Toss, retrieve, retreat. At one point, according to reports, a Sentinelese man walks into the surf up to his thighs. He stands facing the boat. He doesn't raise his bow. He simply stands there, holding an arrow loosely, watching. Another man nearby reportedly makes a gesture, placing the flat of his hand on his own chest, then extending the hand outward toward the visitors. To some on the boat, this looks like a greeting. To others, it looks like a pointed warning. I am here, you are there, keep it that way. Later in the same series of visits, a young Sentinelese man does something else that sticks in the memories of the outsiders. As the boat edges closer than usual, he is said to have stepped forward and touched the tip of an arrow to the chest of a visiting anthropologist who has waded into the shallows. No shot is fired. The arrow doesn't pierce the skin. It is a touch, then a withdrawal. The anthropologist later writes about it with a kind of awe. To him, it feels like a personal encounter, a wordless exchange, perhaps a threat, perhaps a test of courage, perhaps a strange kind of respect. From another angle, it could just as easily be read as the clearest boundary line imaginable. This far, no further. Moments like this feed a particular narrative, that the Sentinelese are coming around, that hostility is a phase to be managed, that with enough patient gift-giving and careful approach, full contact will eventually become possible, maybe even welcomed. You can feel that hope between the lines in some of the official reports from the time. Each expedition that ends without casualties is filed as progress. Each coconut taken is evidence of a supposed thaw. But that reading has a built-in bias. It looks at the few days when gifts are accepted and nobody is hurt, and frames them as steps on a path towards something the visitors already want. Closer contact, conversation, study. It treats the absence of violence as a kind of implicit consent. There are good reasons to doubt that. For one thing, those good days are scattered sparsely among many other encounters where the pattern flips the other way. Visitors approach, gifts or no gifts, and are met immediately with arrows. There are reports of expeditions where, after a series of seemingly calmer visits, the same shoreline suddenly erupts in a storm of shafts the moment a boat inches a little closer than before. The line has been crossed. Whatever leeway existed is abruptly revoked. Even within a single visit, the mood can turn on a knife edge. One 1974 film crew working under government sanction experiences this in dramatic fashion. They first attempt to approach and are met with arrows, one of which reportedly hits a filmmaker in the leg. The crew retreats, then returns later with gifts: coconuts, a pig, a doll. They leave these in the shallows and back away. The Sentinelese come out, kill the pig, bury the doll, take the coconuts. For a brief span, the beach becomes a kind of stage on which both sides perform a ritual of approach and retreat. Then, just as the visitors start to imagine that the exchange has become almost routine, an arrow thuds into the side of their boat. The fragile balance snaps. The crew pulls back in haste. Whatever story they had been telling themselves about friendly contact is instantly rewritten. From the Sentinelese perspective, that day might be remembered quite differently. Strangers came too close. Someone got hurt. We drove them away. Later, they came again, left useful food, tried once more to close the distance, and we reminded them where the boundary lies. In all of these episodes, two things are happening at once. On the surface, there are practical transactions. Coconuts taken, metal tools grabbed, arrows shot or not shot. Underneath, there are mental models being updated on both sides. For the visitors, each gift accepted without incident is a temptation to believe that the previous danger has been solved. They see movement along a path, hostile to wary to friendly. The narrative arc is comforting because it implies that perseverance and the right approach protocol can eventually overcome whatever resistance remains. For the Sentinelese, if we judge by the pattern of their actions rather than the hopes of the intruders, the underlying rule seems far more stable. Distance must be maintained. Resources can be taken if it can be done without letting strangers inside the perimeter. If they push back harder. This is why those short shoreline interactions, as charged and rare as they are in the documentary record, don't really add up to mutual understanding. They are thin slices in time where both sides are hyper-alert, half guessing at each other's intentions, operating on their own internal scripts. There is no shared language. There is no shared history in which both groups agree on what happened before. There is, in a literal sense, no common ground. A Sentinelese man wading waist-deep and taking coconuts from the hands of a stranger may in his own mind be doing nothing more than skillfully skimming value from a dangerous situation before heading back to safety. The person on the boat may, in that same instant, feel a thrill of connection so strong it convinces them they've just witnessed the dawn of a relationship. Both of these subjective experiences can be real at the same time. They do not cancel each other out, but the only one that gets written up in government reports and anthropological papers is the outsider's. This asymmetry is what makes interpreting these almost contacts so fraught. We have details about how many coconuts were taken, how close the boat got, whether arrows were nocked or drawn. We have photographs and shaky film reels. What we don't have is any Sentinelese account of what those days meant to them. Without that, every conclusion about what they want or how they feel about contact is, at best, an educated guess. That uncertainty is not just an academic problem. It has ethical teeth. Because lurking behind every one of these episodes is a deeper question. What weight should curiosity have compared to the right to be left alone? On one side, there is an almost irresistible pull. Here is a human group that has, by all indications, avoided sustained contact with the outside world for centuries, maybe millennia. To anthropologists, that's a once-in-a-species event. To governments, it's a frontier to be mapped, an anomaly to be explained. To ordinary people reading headlines, it's a living mystery. The urge to know is powerful. What do they call themselves? What stories do they tell at night? How did they react the first time they saw a metal ship, a plane, a helicopter? What can their language, their history, their very existence tell us about our own? On the other side, there is the glaring fact that every time strangers have managed to get close to isolated groups like this, the story has tended to go the same way: disease, dependency, cultural shredding. The Sentinelese have seen enough, directly or indirectly, to know that letting outsiders in is not a neutral decision. It can be catastrophic, and everything we can observe about their behaviour suggests that they have chosen, collectively, to refuse that risk. Those moments on the shore where they take gifts but not hands, where they step forward just far enough to seize a coconut and then disappear into the forest, can be read through that lens not as wobbly beginnings of friendship, but as acts of disciplined restraint. Accept the resource, keep the wall. Use the stranger's desire to approach without letting them overrun you. The ethical tension comes from the gap between what outside observers feel in those moments and what the islanders might be trying to assert. When you've just spent months planning a carefully staged approach, getting permissions, coordinating logistics, risking your own safety, it is very tempting to interpret any non-violent interaction as a green light to go one notch further next time. When someone takes your gift, you feel acknowledged. When they don't shoot at you, you feel tolerated. When a man lets you get close enough that you can see the colour of his eyes, you feel, on some instinctive level, almost entitled to keep going. But none of that feeling translates automatically into consent from the other side. Brief, tense exchanges on a tidal flat, mediated by piles of coconuts and the constant threat of arrows, do not constitute a referendum on the entire future of a people. They are not a contract. They are not a binding promise. They are moments, tiny, fragile, reversible. The fact that someone didn't kill you when they could have is not the same thing as them inviting you back. By the late 20th century, this realization begins to sink in, slowly and unevenly, among at least some of the officials and anthropologists involved. The very ambiguity of these almost contacts starts to trouble them. If you can't reliably tell the difference between cautious resource-taking and genuine curiosity about friendship, how do you justify pushing harder? If you know from every comparable historical case that full-blown contact would likely bring waves of disease and dependency, how do you weigh that against your own need to know? Gradually the frame begins to shift from how do we get them to open up to what if trying to make them open up is the problem? The moments where gifts are accepted without apparent hostility stop being seen purely as rungs on a ladder to integration and start to be read, by some at least, as evidence that the Sentinelese are perfectly capable of managing the boundary on their own terms, as long as outsiders don't keep trying to push it. Out of that shift over years and under the pressure of larger debates about indigenous rights in India and around the world, a new idea takes hold. Maybe the most ethical form of engagement with North Sentinel is non-engagement, not because the islanders are backward, not because they're a curiosity to be preserved in a museum-like stasis, but because in the face of radical uncertainty and a clear pattern of refusal, the burden of restraint lies with the more powerful party. The gift-dropping missions wind down. The helicopters come less often. A new language starts appearing in official documents. Protection, isolation, no-go zone. How that policy came to be, and how it's been tested by shipwrecks, poachers, and one very determined missionary, is its own tangled story. But it grows directly out of those strange, charged, almost encounters on the beach, out of sacks of coconuts taken and arrows sometimes, but not always, held in check. If the story ended there, with the government backing away, the helicopters grounded, the official line shifting from contact to protection, it would almost be neat. A rare case where curiosity bows to caution, where a powerful society agrees, however grudgingly, to leave a small group of people alone. But that's not how it works. Because even as the Indian state begins to institutionalize distance, something else is happening in the background. The Sentinelese are becoming famous, not because anyone knows them, but precisely because nobody does. Every few years a new headline circulates, "World's last uncontacted tribe repels visitors." A grainy photo gets shared, tiny figures on a bright strip of sand, bows raised toward a hovering helicopter. A phrase starts getting attached to them, repeated in news reports, documentaries, online listicles. The most isolated tribe on Earth. That superlative is catnip to the human imagination. It turns an island the size of a small town into a kind of psychic focal point. If this is the last uncontacted tribe, then in some sense it becomes a symbol of everything we imagine is vanishing. Untouched cultures, pre-modern ways of life, the idea that somewhere, somehow, there is still a place outside the reach of phones, satellites, and global supply chains. Last is a dangerous word. It implies an ending, and endings generate urgency. You start hearing phrases like "before it's too late," "while there is still time." Those don't just motivate scientists and policymakers. They trigger something deep in ordinary people too. The same impulse that makes us line up to see the final performance, read the final chapter, witness the final eclipse. North Sentinel becomes, for many outsiders who will never go near it, a story they feel weirdly personally invested in. It's a tiny black box on the map of a world that otherwise feels overexposed. And where there's a black box, there's a powerful temptation. What if I'm the one who gets inside? That temptation isn't just emotional. For governments, administrators, and navies, North Sentinel has always had a more pragmatic significance. Look at a map of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and you can see why. They sit like stepping stones between India and Southeast Asia, right in the middle of busy shipping lanes. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the archipelago is treated as a strategic asset, first by the British, then by independent India. Military bases, penal colonies, radar stations, and later tourist infrastructure spread across islands that were once the domain of small scattered hunter-gatherer groups. In that context, an unadministered island isn't just a curiosity. It's a question mark in a region the state wants to read clearly. In the age of empires, that question took a familiar form. Who lives there? Can they be controlled, taxed, converted, civilized? Later, as India's security concerns shifted toward border surveillance and maritime control, the questions changed tone but not entirely their underlying logic. Could the island be used by smugglers, foreign agents, poachers? Is there a need for a post, a patrol route, at least a clear understanding of who is on the ground and how they might react in a crisis? When the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami hits, This administrative impulse collides directly with the Sentinelese refusal to be seen. The waves rip through the Andamans, killing thousands. The government scrambles to assess the damage. One of the key questions: did the most vulnerable, isolated group survive? Helicopters are dispatched to fly over North Sentinel. The pilots are told to look for bodies, signs of habitation, anything. When they circle low, one of the most replayed scenes in the island's modern history unfolds. A Sentinelese man stepping out onto the beach and firing arrows at the hovering machine. On one level, it's a perfect media moment, the embodiment of defiance. On another, it's a bureaucratic box being ticked. We verified they're alive, we recorded their presence, we did our duty. Even humanitarian concern in this context is filtered through an administrative lens. Who counts as a population to be monitored? Who as a people to be left to their own fate? Once an island is inside that mental grid, listed on maps, mentioned in security briefings, included in disaster management plans, it becomes harder, not easier, to ignore. The state has to keep reminding itself not to intervene more, not to push further, and bureaucracies are not famous for restraint. Add to this the scientific layer. For anthropologists, linguists, geneticists, and historians of human migration, North Sentinel is not just a dot on the map, it's a tantalizing possibility. Here is a small human society that, by all accounts, has had minimal sustained contact with outsiders for centuries. Their language is unrecorded. Their oral histories, if they exist in forms comparable to other cultures, are uncollected. Their genes, which might carry clues about ancient population movements in the Bay of Bengal, are untranslated. Their material culture, from houses to canoes to tools, has only been glimpsed from a distance. In an academic culture where careers, grants and prestige are often built on originality, on going somewhere no one has fully documented before, North Sentinel looks to some like the ultimate blank field site. You can almost hear the arguments in the margins of old proposal drafts. If we approached carefully, if we took every possible medical precaution, if we limited contact to a handful of individuals, we could record a language on the brink of disappearing, document a way of life that might never exist again, capture invaluable data for understanding human diversity. Behind these arguments lurks another, more subtle one, the idea of a vanishing world. For decades, anthropologists have watched small-scale societies be absorbed, often brutally, into national and global systems. Every time a new highway cuts through a forest, every time a mine displaces a village, every time a remote community gets pulled into a cash economy, a familiar lament surfaces: we are losing cultures. In that mood, studying the Sentinelese can start to sound like an act of preservation. Get the data before the world crushes them. Record their language before it dies. Archive their stories so that, even if their way of life changes, something of it remains. What this framing often skates past is the uncomfortable fact that turning people into precious data is just another way of instrumentalizing them. The logic might be gentler than colonial conquest, but the basic asymmetry remains. Their right not to be known is weighed against our desire to know, and the scales keep trying to tilt toward us. And then there's the media. Once an image goes viral, the man on the beach with the bow, the helicopter hovering just out of arrow range, the island stops being an obscure anthropological case study and becomes content. Documentaries pitch the Sentinelese as Stone Age holdouts. News segments run with dramatic music and phrases like primitive tribe and forbidden island. Thumbnails show zoomed-in figures with weapons raised, eyes shaded, faces unreadable. Sensationalism thrives on contrast and danger. A hyper-connected audience scrolling on phones is suddenly shown a place with no phones, no electricity, and people allegedly willing to kill to keep it that way. That contrast is irresistible to editors and algorithms alike. It gets clicks. It keeps viewers from swiping away. So the narrative gets sharpened, simplified, and repeated. Last uncontacted tribe, hostile to all outsiders, mysterious, dangerous, pure. Each retelling, especially in mass media, does two things at once. It amplifies the aura of taboo. You must not go there, and it plants a seed of challenge. Nobody has ever really gotten in. To most people, this is just an intriguing fact to bring up at parties. To a small subset, adventurers, would-be influencers, people with a taste for extreme travel or spiritual quests, it looks like an invitation. You can see the psychology in other domains. Tell people there is a door that must never be opened, and a few will dedicate their lives to picking the lock. Say, restricted area, and someone will see a dare. When that door is attached to moral language, we must protect these people from us. The dynamic gets even weirder. Some will accept the argument, others will quietly decide that they, personally, are the exception. That's where personal, ideological, and thrill-seeking motives come in. For some intruders, the draw is straightforward adrenaline. These are the people who collect forbidden experiences the way others collect stamps. They sneak into abandoned amusement parks, climb skyscrapers at night, swim in restricted reservoirs. For them, North Sentinel represents the ultimate trespass. Not just a fence to hop, but a taboo that has been explicitly codified in law and reinforced by stories of real risk. Getting close, even if only to photograph the beach from a boat, becomes a badge of honour. Others come with more elaborate justifications. A few frame their desire in religious terms. They feel called to bring faith or salvation or some kind of moral message to a people they've never spoken to and know almost nothing about. The dangers are recast as tests of devotion. Legal prohibitions start to look, to them, like obstacles put up by a secular or misguided world. If the Sentinelese shoot at missionaries, that hostility can be interpreted not as a rational defence, but as spiritual resistance to be overcome. There are also those who cloak their curiosity in a humanitarian wrapper. They insist they only want to help, to bring medicine or education or technology. In this telling, the islanders are trapped in ignorance or suffering, and refusing contact is a kind of misguided stubbornness they believe they can gently correct. They may genuinely mean well, but the structure of the story puts them in the role of saviour, and the Sentinelese in the role of passive recipients, waiting to be enlightened. Even people with explicitly scientific goals can slip, almost without noticing, into this same pattern. They start by telling themselves a careful, bounded story, a single contact mission, properly equipped, with minimal risk, to gather crucial data. Over time, as grants loom and publications beckon, the qualifiers can erode. The ethical questions get backgrounded. The unfinished sentences, as long as nothing goes wrong, fade from view. What all these motives share, whether driven by faith, fame, curiosity, or adrenaline, is a quiet centering of the outsider's narrative over the islander's actions. The Sentinelese shoot arrows. That becomes a detail in someone else's heroic story about courage, sacrifice, or persecution. The government posts a 5-kilometre exclusion zone around the island. That becomes a puzzle to be solved, a boundary to be gamed. Each legal and physical barrier is absorbed into the mythology. This place must be incredible if they're trying this hard to keep me out. The irony is brutal. The more consistently the Sentinelese enforce their no, the more fascinating that no becomes. The more firmly Indian law declares the island off limits, the more its legend as a forbidden frontier grows. Protection, which is supposed to reduce pressure, ends up adding to the aura that attracts certain personalities in the first place. And because stories travel faster than boats, each rare, dramatic incident, an arrow at a helicopter, a confrontation with poachers, a killing on the beach, ripples outward through news feeds and social media. Most readers' response is shock, maybe anger, maybe a renewed conviction that the island should be left alone. But scattered among them are a few who feel something else, a prickle of obsession. They start to wonder what it would be like to go where no one is allowed, to rewrite the script, to succeed where governments and expeditions have failed. Meanwhile, the Sentinelese continue doing the one thing they have done, consistently, across centuries of shifting outside motives, enforcing distance. From their perspective, it likely doesn't matter whether the strangers on the horizon are missionaries, scientists, thrill seekers, or naval officers. A boat is a boat. A figure on the sand is a potential threat. The arrow drawn and sometimes released is a simple, universal response to an unwanted approach. The tragedy and the moral test for the rest of us lie in recognizing that our reasons for wanting to cross that distance, no matter how noble they sound in our own heads, do not automatically outweigh their repeated insistence on keeping it. And, as history shows, the biggest danger to groups like the Sentinels has never come from their own arrows. It has come from the invisible things that travel with well-meaning visitors, microbes, market economies, dreams of progress. Those dangers are precisely what make the logic of isolation, from their side of the surf line, so hard to argue with. When people hear that outsiders are banned from going within a few kilometers of North Sentinel, the first thing many imagine is violence, arrows, spears, maybe being dragged into the forest and never seen again. The danger that actually keeps Indian officials awake at night is much smaller and far more mundane. It fits under your fingernails, it rides in your saliva, it hangs in the air when you cough. It's microbes. When a population lives for a long time with very little contact with outsiders, its immune system is tuned to the diseases in its own ecological neighbourhood. The Sentinelese almost certainly know how to deal with the infections that have circulated on their island for generations. They will have traditional treatments, herbal remedies, practical knowledge about which plants help and which don't. Natural selection will have quietly favoured people whose immune systems handle those local pathogens better. What they probably don't have is any immunity to the global disease pool that you and I swim in every day without thinking. Measles, influenza, chickenpox, mumps, whooping cough, the common cold viruses that bounce around schools and offices every winter. Those childhood diseases that most of the world treats as background noise are only mild, because most of us encounter them in societies saturated with prior exposure, vaccination, and basic medical care. Drop those same viruses into an immunologically naive community, and they turn into weapons of mass destruction. We don't need to speculate wildly about what would happen. We have a pretty grim record from other parts of the world. When Europeans arrived in the Americas after 1492, they didn't just bring steel, guns, and horses. They brought smallpox, influenza, measles, and a handful of other infections that had evolved in dense Eurasian populations living with domesticated animals. Indigenous populations across North and South America had never encountered these pathogens before. Their immune systems, shaped by different histories, were unprepared. The results were catastrophic. In some regions, historians and demographers estimate population collapses of 70, 80, even over 90% within a few generations. Whole villages emptied out. Oral histories describe waves of sickness so sudden and so intense that there was no one left healthy enough to bury the dead. War and slavery made things worse, but disease was the great scythe. Similar patterns show up in the Pacific. When outsiders began visiting Hawaii regularly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they brought measles, whooping cough, and influenza. Hawaiian oral tradition and missionary records alike describe epidemics tearing through communities that had no experience with those illnesses. The population of the islands dropped dramatically in less than a century. In the Amazon, records from the 20th century show entire small groups wiped out by diseases like influenza and measles after first contact with rubber tappers, missionaries, or road-building crews. Sometimes the first people to arrive thought they were helping. They brought clothes, metal tools, maybe a bit of medicine. They also, without realizing it, brought viruses on those clothes, on those tools, in their own lungs. Even in the 1960s and 70s, when antibiotics and vaccines were well known, first contact missions with previously isolated groups often triggered deadly epidemics. Measles alone repeatedly killed 20, 30, 40% of people in newly contacted villages, despite what the organizers believed were careful precautions. That's the key. The people walking ashore were often convinced they had planned for everything. They disinfected equipment, they got their own shots, they brought doctors, and still, the act of showing up, breathing, talking, handing over gifts, was enough. So when officials and anthropologists talk about the problem of disease in relation to the Sentinelese, they're not imagining some exotic island-specific plague. They're looking at this long, bloody ledger of first contact history and seeing the same pattern ready to repeat. Now, to stay grounded, we do not know exactly how medically vulnerable the Sentinelese are. No one has done blood tests. No one has taken detailed health histories. We can't say with certainty that a particular virus would do X or Y to them, and any precise prediction would be more storytelling than science. What we can say, based on immunology and precedent, is that small, isolated populations tend to have less exposure to the constant churn of global pathogens. They tend to have fewer immune memories of things like measles and influenza. They tend to lack vaccination. Add those together and you get high risk. Even something as trivial seeming as a common cold can be dangerous if it spreads through a group that has never experienced that exact virus before, especially if there are no antibiotics to treat secondary bacterial infections, no rehydration therapy, no hospital down the road. A simple respiratory virus that lays you up in bed for a few days could push someone already under nutritional or environmental stress over the edge. This is why modern guidelines for working with isolated indigenous groups in places like the Amazon now recommend something that, on the surface, looks cold-blooded. Do not initiate contact at all unless the group clearly, repeatedly signals that they want it, and even then approach with extreme caution. Because once you open that door, you open it not just to the people you carefully vetted, but to every microbe they carry and every opportunist who follows in their wake. The Sentinelese sit at the far end of that spectrum. They have not asked for contact, quite the opposite. Every time someone has tried to get close in a sustained way, they have pushed back with unmistakable clarity. From a public health perspective, that refusal is not just a cultural preference, it's a kind of immunological firewall. Here's the uncomfortable part for well-meaning outsiders. You can take antibiotics, you can get every vaccine available, you can shower in antiseptic soap, you can arrive with a backpack full of medical supplies and years of training. You still cannot guarantee that you're not carrying something their bodies have never seen before. Respiratory viruses can incubate silently for days. People are contagious before they show symptoms. Bacteria live on your skin, in your mouth, in your gut. Some of them are harmless to you and potentially lethal to others. There is no practical way to completely sterilize a human visitor. So when someone says, "I only want to bring them medicine," the brutal answer from epidemiology is, you would also be bringing disease. You cannot separate the two. That's why, over time, the entire approach to North Sentinel has drifted from how do we make contact safely to how do we avoid contact as much as possible. It's not because curiosity disappeared, or because governments stopped caring about the islanders' welfare. It's because the equation of risk versus reward shifted decisively as evidence accumulated. In the 1970s and 80s, Indian authorities conducted what they called contact expeditions to North Sentinel. Officials and anthropologists would approach by boat, leave coconuts and other gifts on the beach, observe reactions and withdraw. Sometimes the Sentinelers accepted the offerings, sometimes they shot arrows, sometimes they vanished into the trees and watched from cover. Even then, some people in the administration worried about disease. They tried to limit the number of visitors. They insisted on health checks. But the basic model still assumed that proximity was the path to understanding. By the 1990s, attitudes had begun to change. Reports from disasters elsewhere, from botched contacts in the Amazon, from the rapid cultural and health deterioration of other Andamanese groups under sustained outside pressure, all started to weigh heavily. The Jarawa, for example, another indigenous group in the archipelago, experienced sharp increases in illness, malnutrition, and exploitation when roads and settlements pushed into their territory. The lesson was ugly and simple. Contact, even when labelled development or integration, often translated into infections, alcohol dependency, and demographic collapse. In 1996, India officially ended its North Sentinel contact expeditions. The new policy was non-interference. Watch from a distance. Do not land, do not try to talk, do not deliver gifts. Do not repeat on a smaller scale the epidemiological disasters that had unfolded all over the world. This is where distance-based observation comes in. If you absolutely need to know whether the Sentinelese survived a tsunami, you send a helicopter or a plane to fly high enough that rotor wash and noise don't directly harass people on the ground. You use cameras with good zoom, you look for signs of life. You don't hover low over the beach. You don't drop packages out of the sky. You don't stay any longer than necessary. If you want to monitor illegal fishing or poaching around the island, you patrol at the edge of the exclusion zone with ships and drones, not by casually cruising up to the reef and shouting questions ashore. It's an imperfect compromise. You get less information. You leave more questions unanswered, but you also avoid turning your curiosity into someone else's epidemic. The health logic behind this isn't just medical, it becomes legal. As India's understanding of the risks grew, and as international norms around the rights of indigenous peoples hardened, the country's government had to ask itself a different question. Not, can we reach them, but what obligations do we have not to? If you know from centuries of global experience that contacting a group like the Sentinelese carries a high probability of spreading disease and destabilizing their entire way of life, then failing to prevent that contact starts to look less like benign neglect and more like negligence. Indian law now reflects that shift. Under the Andaman and Nicobar regulations and related policies, it is illegal to approach within a set distance, usually cited as around 5 kilometers, of North Sentinel Island without special authorization. This isn't framed primarily as protecting outsiders from arrows. It's framed as protecting the Sentinelese from us. That exclusion zone is a kind of institutionalized respect for their immune systems and their autonomy. It recognizes that in the moral calculus of contact, the stakes are wildly asymmetrical. We lose a thrilling story or a bit of data. They could lose half their population to a virus that we write off as a seasonal nuisance. Of course, laws are only as strong as their enforcement and the stories people tell themselves about why they should be obeyed. The same mythology that casts North Sentinel as a forbidden frontier can make the exclusion zone look like a challenge instead of a boundary. But when the Indian Coast Guard turns a boat away or arrests someone trying to sneak in, they're not just defending a line on a map. They're acting as bouncers for an immune system that has never had to deal with the things we take for granted. In that sense, the logic of isolation isn't mystical or romantic. It's brutally practical. From the islanders' point of view, keeping strangers at arrow's length has so far worked. They survived the British, the Japanese occupation of the Andamans, Indian development projects, the 2004 tsunami. Each time, what probably helped most was not some hidden technological secret or genetic superpower. It was distance. Our challenge, watching from the outside, is to accept that the best way to help may be to leave that distance intact, to resist the impulse to collapse it in the name of curiosity, faith, or even medical charity. Because on a planet where planes can carry viruses around the world in hours, the last line of defense for a society like the Sentinelese is still the oldest one in our species' history, staying far enough away that your breath never reaches their lungs. When a modern state draws a circle on a map and says, "No one goes in here," it's not just making a rule. It's staking a claim about whose lives count, whose choices matter, and what kind of future is worth protecting. North Sentinel sits inside one of those circles. On paper, this is all very bureaucratic. India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands are part of a union territory, governed from the mainland. There's a lieutenant governor, a civil administration, police, coast guard, forest department, the whole apparatus of a modern state. North Sentinel, like every other speck of land out there, is technically Indian soil, but in reality the Sentinelese live in a legal and ethical exception zone. They are citizens of a country that has never collected their taxes, never enrolled their children in school, never conducted a census on their island. They are under the protection of a government whose laws they do not know exist, whose language they do not speak, and whose presence they usually greet with arrows. That paradox, full sovereignty on paper, almost total non-interference in practice, didn't happen overnight. For most of the colonial period, the Andaman Islands were treated as a remote outpost and a penal colony. The British built prisons, imported convicts, cleared forests, and pushed aside indigenous communities whose claims to the land were invisible in imperial paperwork. The Sentinelese were noticed, but largely avoided. They were written about as hostile, savage, intractable. The default policy was not protection. It was, we have other things to worry about. After independence, the Indian government inherited both the territory and the tangle of moral questions that came with it. In the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the dominant idea in Indian policy circles was still some version of integration or development. The expectation was that indigenous groups would, sooner or later, be brought into the national mainstream, learn Hindi or English, adopt settled agriculture, send their children to school, become part of the modern economy. For some Andamanese groups, that process began aggressively. Settlements were established, roads were cut through forests. Tribal welfare officers encouraged or pressured people to move, to accept rations, to travel to town. The results were mixed at best, disastrous at worst. It was against that background that the first serious attempts to reach the Sentinelese were made, framed as scientific and humanitarian missions. Anthropologists and officials, armed with coconuts and curiosity, headed out in government boats. They landed briefly on the beaches, left gifts, retreated. They took notes about gestures, weapons, body language. They dreamed of one day sitting in a Sentinelese hut, drinking some unknown fermented beverage, swapping stories through a translator. Those dreams never materialized. The arrows did. The contact expeditions of the late 20th century produced a few striking photographs, some tantalizing anecdotes, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, this wall could be chipped away. They also produced a slow, dawning realization inside the Indian state. Pushing harder might cross a line from research into harm. By the 1990s, the world beyond North Sentinel had changed in ways that mattered. The global conversation about indigenous rights had shifted. Documents like the ILO Convention, 169, and later the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples put concepts like self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent into official language. Brazil, Peru, and other countries wrestling with uncontacted groups in the Amazon were starting to abandon proactive contact missions in favour of leave-them-alone policies. Inside India, the record from closer neighbours was also becoming impossible to ignore. The Great Andamanese, once a set of distinct groups numbering thousands, had collapsed to a few dozen heavily assimilated individuals, their languages and lifeways almost erased. The Ong had suffered dramatic population decline after contact. The Jarawa, brought into regular contact by roads and settlers, were facing disease spikes, dependency on food handouts, sexual exploitation. Seen through that lens, North Sentinel wasn't a tantalizing blank spot on the anthropological map anymore. It was the last Andamanese group that hadn't been pulled into that destructive orbit. So the policy flipped. In 1996, India officially called off its North Sentinel contact expeditions. The anthropologists put away their baskets of coconuts. The file changed from tribal contact to tribal protection. Instead of planning for the next approach, the administration started planning for how to keep everyone else away. That's where the no-go zone comes in. Under regulations like the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, protection of Aboriginal tribes. Regulation, often shortened to ANPATR. Specific areas are declared tribal reserves. Entry is prohibited or strictly controlled. For North Sentinel, that principle hardened into a simple, blunt rule. No one is allowed within a certain radius, usually described as about 5 nautical miles, of the island without explicit government permission. Fishing boats are not supposed to drop lines on its reefs. Tourist vessels are not supposed to swing by for a closer look. Adventurers are not supposed to paddle in on kayaks with GoPros. Missionaries are not supposed to sneak in under cover of darkness with waterproof Bibles. On paper, the language is dry. Prohibitions, penalties, authorization procedures. On the ground, it's something closer to a shield. If you're a Sentinelese child playing near the beach, that invisible circle is your firewall. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Coast Guard cutters and patrol boats act as moving segments of that line, nudging fishing trawlers away, escorting curious yachts back toward the main islands, sometimes arresting people who thought those rules were negotiable. Enforcement, though, is never as clean as drawing a circle on a chart. The Andaman Sea is busy. There are local fishermen from other islands. There are long-distance poachers from Myanmar or Thailand looking for turtles, sharks, or sea cucumbers. There are merchant ships cutting through the wider region. There are storms that push boats off course, engines that fail, GPS units that go dark at the worst possible moment. The Indian Coast Guard and local marine police don't have infinite resources. They patrol, but they can't be everywhere. Radar coverage has gaps. Weather sometimes grounds aircraft. The exclusion zone around North Sentinel exists in law, but in practice it's a moving, flexible bubble, sometimes robust, sometimes thin. This is how illegal fishing boats could anchor near the island in the 2000s, and why, in 2018, an American missionary was able to pay local fishermen to take him close enough to attempt repeated landings. The law said no. The physical world of tides, money, and human stubbornness created loopholes. Each of those incursions forces Indian authorities right up against a difficult set of questions. What exactly does it mean to protect a people who do not want to meet you, but who live inside your borders? How far does your duty to them extend? And at what point does protection slide into a kind of prison, where their freedom of action is defined by your restraint? International law says states have sovereignty over their territory. That includes the power to control borders, to regulate travel, to enforce criminal law. Human rights frameworks add another layer, insisting that indigenous peoples have the right to maintain their own cultures, to control their lands, to refuse integration. With North Sentinel, those layers don't quite line up neatly. The Sentinelese have never been asked what they want in the terms used by UN documents. They have never signed anything. Their no has been delivered through arrows and avoidance, not through lawyers and representatives. So Indian policymakers have had to read that no as best they can, then translate it into policy. The result is a kind of asymmetrical compromise. On one side, the Indian state asserts its sovereignty. The island is Indian territory. The people living on it are Indian citizens. The Navy and Coast Guard patrol the waters. On the other side, the same state promises not to use that sovereignty to change the Sentinelese way of life without their clear invitation. That's why, after incidents, the response often looks strange to outside observers. A ship runs aground on the reef, and sailors scramble onto the beach. The Sentinelese come out and attack. Some sailors are killed, others rescued later by helicopter. The natural instinct of many viewers is, send a medical team, help the injured islanders, investigate, maybe bring justice for the dead. But any attempt to help the Sentinelese in a conventional way, landing rescue teams, setting up a field clinic, conducting interviews, would be exactly the kind of close, cough-range contact that carries the highest disease risk. It would also override the clearly expressed wishes of the islanders not to have strangers in their space. So officials do something that, to people unfamiliar with the context, can look brutally indifferent. They retrieve the survivors and the bodies they can safely access, then pull back. They do not storm the island to punish the attackers. They do not chase Sentinelese men into the forest with handcuffs. They do not attempt to arrest anyone. In any other jurisdiction in India, an arrow through someone's chest would trigger a homicide investigation, a manhunt, a criminal trial. On North Sentinel, it triggers a policy memo reminding everyone that entering tribal reserves is illegal and extraordinarily dangerous. This isn't because the Indian state thinks Sentinelese lives are above the law. It's because applying the usual law enforcement logic, investigate, arrest, prosecute, would require exactly the kind of deep, sustained intrusion that policy is now designed to avoid. The price of treating them like any other village would likely be their rapid medical and cultural destruction. Even delivering what most people would unanimously call aid is complicated. Food drops, for instance, sound kind, but regular deliveries of rations can shift economic systems, create dependency, and draw in opportunists who want a slice of the aid budget. Clothes can carry pathogens, but even if perfectly sterilized, they can change dress and body practices in ways that have their own health and social consequences. Medicines handed over with no shared language or medical framework can be misused, misunderstood, or spark conflicts. That's why India's current approach is built around minimalism: intervene as little as possible and only to prevent worse harms. Prevent, for example, outside exploitation. Poachers who might want to raid the island's shores or kidnap people are a real threat. A hands-off attitude toward the Sentinelese does not extend to people trying to get at them. Here the state's duty flips. It must be willing to use force against its own citizens or foreign intruders to maintain the island's isolation. There's also environmental protection folded into this. The reefs and forests around North Sentinel are effectively a no-take zone by default. The same legal walls that keep tourists and missionaries out also give the island's ecosystem a rare, accidental sanctuary. From a distance, this looks like a clean, noble policy. We have learned from history. We will not repeat those mistakes. We will guard this last pocket of human difference. Up close, it's messier. Consider autonomy. The Sentinelese did not choose their no-go zone. They did not ask that fishing boats be turned away or that curious travellers be arrested on their behalf. They also did not ask for the opposite. Their world has been shaped by outside decisions they never voted on, made in languages they do not understand. There's also the issue of representation. Other indigenous groups in India have activists, leaders, NGOs that speak on their behalf in courts and in the media. The Sentinelese have none of that. Their voice in policy debates is entirely mediated by outsiders, anthropologists, administrators, lawyers, and international bodies interpreting their gestures, their arrows, their silences. So India's legal framework around North Sentinel is, in a sense, a bet. A bet that non-interference, enforced by the threat of fines and jail for would-be visitors, is closer to what the Sentinelists would choose if they could sit in Parliament and argue their case. A bet that the moral disaster of forced contact outweighs the potential benefits of medical care or economic integration. It's a bet that many Indigenous rights advocates support. It's also one that leaves some questions hanging in the air. What happens if climate change alters the island's freshwater supply? What if a cyclone devastates their food sources? At what point does non-interference turn into abandonment? For now, the answer has been to watch from afar, to intervene only at arm's length. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, for instance, helicopters flew over North Sentinel to see if anyone was still there. Sentinelist men came out on the beach and shot arrows at the helicopter. The crew took that as the clearest signal you could ask for. They had survived, and they still wanted strangers to stay away. The exclusion zone remains. It is not perfect. It can be circumvented. It raises as many philosophical questions as it answers. But in a world where most isolated groups have already been swallowed by outside contact, with all the plagues, promises, and pressures that come with it, that thin legal circle around North Sentinel may be the only thing standing between one tiny society and the full blast of the 21st century. And sometimes, despite the best efforts to maintain that barrier, the outside world crashes in anyway. A shipwreck on the reef, a desperate crew, a handful of castaways stumbling onto a forbidden shore, about to discover what happens when the no-go line is crossed not by design, but by accident. North Sentinel is not just hard to reach because of laws and patrol boats. It's hard to reach because the island itself fights you. If you look at a satellite image, you don't see a neat circle of land rising out of deep blue water. You see a pale turquoise ring, a shallow coral platform, wrapped around most of the shore. That reef is beautiful from space and brutal up close. Outside the ring, the water can drop off fast. Inside, it's a maze of coral heads, sudden sandbanks and channels that change with storms. Add to that the currents of the Andaman Sea. This part of the Indian Ocean is not a quiet bathtub. Monsoon winds drive seasonal flows. Tidal currents funnel between islands. A ship that loses power or steering in bad weather can be pushed a long way before anyone has time to react. If that drifting line happens to cross the unmarked circle around North Sentinel, the reef is waiting. That's why, long before the words no-go zone showed up in official documents, there were stories of ships cracking their hulls on those unseen teeth of coral. Some of those stories are very specific. The name of the vessel, the year, the cargo, what the captain did next. Others are looser, passed around as tales of traders or fishermen who got too close and paid for it. One often cited wreck from the late 20th century involves a merchant ship that ran aground on the reef at night. The vessel stuck fast. The tide dropped. The crew woke up not at sea but tilted on their side, the hull grinding slowly on coral. In the grey morning light they looked toward the shore and saw figures gathering among the trees. From the crew's perspective, this was a nightmare pile-up of dangers. The ship was damaged. They had limited fresh water. Their radio contact was uncertain. They were suddenly within striking distance of people they'd been told, vaguely, second-hand, were hostile. Men appeared on the beach with bows, watching, testing the distance, sometimes letting arrows fall short as warnings, sometimes thudding them into the hull. In some retellings, those arrows escalate quickly, hitting the ship, landing near crew members, creating a sense of siege. In others, the islanders keep their distance, shouting, gesturing, making it abundantly clear the wreck is not welcome as a new piece of real estate. In most versions, the crew stays on board and waits, white-knuckled, until a rescue vessel and eventually helicopters arrive to winch them out one by one, while the Sentinelese watch from below, shooting occasionally at the machines overhead. The broad outline, a wrecked ship, stranded men, Sentinelese appearing on the beach, a tense rescue, is supported by multiple sources, including official references and later news reporting. But when you drill down into details, things blur. How close did the islanders actually get? How many arrows were fired? Were any of the crew seriously injured, or were the shots mostly deterrent? Different accounts give different answers, often depending on whether they come from government summaries, crew interviews, or retellings in books and documentaries written years later. That fuzziness is not unique to this incident. Maritime mishaps around North Sentinel sit at an awkward junction between bureaucratic reports, sensational headlines, and the opaque reality of an island that cannot give its own version of events. There are mentions of fishing boats that drifted onto the reef, their crews scrambling to the sand and then disappearing from the record except for a line in an official file and a brief, lurid paragraph in a newspaper. There's the infamous case of 2 illegal crab fishers in the 2000s who were reportedly killed on the beach after their boat drifted too close and anchored overnight. We know about them mostly through Indian authorities describing what their patrols saw from a distance. The Sentinelese did not file an incident report. It's tempting from the outside to stitch all these fragments together into a neat cinematic pattern. Boat appears, islanders attack, government swoops in. Reality is both uglier and less certain. Sometimes no one arrives in time. Sometimes the only clear record is a body on the beach, seen through binoculars from a ship that cannot land. Sometimes Indian officials with access to internal logs and communications choose, quite deliberately, not to release all the details, precisely because publicity can create copycat attempts, legal headaches, and international uproar. That secrecy has a function. It hampers researchers and fuels speculation, but it also lowers the odds that every close call will be turned into a viral story, attracting the next wave of glory seekers. What is clear from the cases we do know is this. Rescue operations near North Sentinel are dangerous for everyone involved. Start with the stranded outsiders. If you're stuck on a wreck or a beach within bowshot of Sentinelese archers, you're vulnerable. You don't know their language. You don't know their signals. You may not even know in the moment that this island is specifically one of the world's most contact-averse communities. You just see people with weapons who appear to be angry that you exist where you're standing. From your perspective, every arrow looks like aggression. You're not thinking about a century of intrusions or about illegal fishers who may have shot at islanders in the past, or about rumours of kidnappings and abductions that circulate quietly among officials. You're thinking, they are trying to kill me. Now flip the camera. From the Sentinelese point of view, A ship or boat that shows up uninvited and refuses to leave is not distressed. It is a breach. It is, at minimum, a potential raid on their resources, their women, their children. Oral histories, if they exist, might recall times when strangers brought not just iron and cloth, but violence and kidnappings. More recent experiences might include fishermen dropping nets on their reefs, shooting at turtles or firing guns into the air to scare them away from rich fishing grounds. In that context, a vessel that runs aground but stays put looks less like an accident and more like the latest in a long line of armed trespassers. The men on board may be waving their arms, shouting, even holding their hands up in what they think is the universal sign of "we mean no harm." To the islanders, those are just moving shapes at the edge of their world. They respond with the tools they trust: arrows, shouted warnings, displays of readiness. What to the castaways feels like survival pleading may, to the islanders, look exactly like the opening moves of a push inland. This mutual misreading is magnified during actual rescue operations. Imagine a helicopter hovering over the reef, wind screaming, salt spray flying, a steel bird dipping and rising in a deafening arc. For the crew, this is salvation arriving. For the Sentinelese, it's a terrifying, incomprehensible intrusion blaring into their sky, rattling palms, kicking up sand in the space where their children play. When they shoot arrows at the helicopter, are they trying to kill the castaways? Or are they trying to drive away the machine that is tearing open their quiet and might, for all they know, drop fire? Indian pilots and commandos going in for these extractions have to think about all of this. They are tasked with saving citizens or foreign nationals in immediate danger. They are also under strict orders not to land on the island, not to initiate any contact with Sentinelese on the ground, not to retaliate if they are shot at. Their job is to reach over an invisible fence, grab the outsiders by the scruff of the neck, and yank them back without letting so much as a boot print cross the line. That balancing act can turn even a straightforward rescue into a high-risk maneuver. Helicopters have to stay high enough to minimize the chance of an arrow hitting a crucial part, low enough for winch lines to be practical. Boats have to approach just close enough to pick up people in the water, but not so close that islanders can realistically reach them with arrows or spears. Everyone has to resist the instinct to push back if they feel threatened. An arrow through a helicopter door that, under any other circumstances, might justify an armed response is here treated as something like a force of nature. Dangerous, painful, but not to be answered in kind. The risk to the islanders is quieter, but no less real. Every extra minute that a stranded person spends on the beach, every object they touch, every cough they suppress can be, in theory, a path for pathogens. A shirt hanging on a branch, a plastic water bottle rolling in the tide, a pocket knife left behind in the sand. These are vectors for both disease and disruption. Authorities, painfully aware of what Eurasian diseases did to indigenous Americas, carry that history into every decision. That's part of why they often prefer air extractions to beach landings. Picking someone up from a wrecked vessel or from the shallows without setting foot on land keeps the risk lower, though never zero. If a casualty dies on the beach before a helicopter arrives, there is an excruciating additional question. Do you try to retrieve the body, exposing everyone to more interaction, or do you leave it, knowing that local scavengers, animal and human, will eventually interact with it? None of these choices are clean. They are judgments made in crisis, often with incomplete information, then second-guessed later by people with far more time and far less skin in the game. What the pattern of shipwrecks and rescues does show, in stark relief, is how sharp and well-defended the island's boundaries are. The Sentinelese do not patrol the open sea. They do not send canoes to visit neighbouring islands. They do not attempt to board passing ships. Their vigilance is tightly focused on that thin belt where water turns to land, the zone where a stranger's foot would first touch their home. Again and again, accounts describe the same choreography, a vessel appears or drifts within sight. Sentinelese scouts emerge at the tree line, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups. They watch, they call out, they test the range of their arrows. If the strangers move closer to shore, the men move too, staying just ahead of the tide, drawing a living line that says, unmistakably, this far, no further. Occasionally you hear about gestures that might, in another context, be read as curiosity or even something like negotiation. Men wading into the surf, pointing, shouting, perhaps making the same go-away motions that anthropologists recorded decades ago during gift drop expeditions. But the underlying message remains the same. They do not want castaways camping on their sand, building shelters from wreckage, exploring the interior while they wait for help. Even in emergencies, the island is not open. And yet, despite that firmness, there's no sign of organised Sentinelese attempts to hunt down survivors once they have been removed. No recorded raids on nearby islands, no evidence of pursuit across water. Their vigilance is territorial, not expansionist. They are not trying to conquer the people who wash up. They are trying to prevent those people from becoming the camel's nose under their tent. So when we zoom out from the individual stories, the cracked hulls, the panicked radio calls, the arrows clattering against steel, a bigger picture comes into view. Shipwrecks near North Sentinel expose the raw edges of the island's relationship with the modern world. They show us how fragile the legal no-go circle is when faced with storms, greed and bad luck. They show us how, in the absence of a shared language, a survival situation can look like aggression from both directions. And they reveal just how constant and how deliberate Sentinelese vigilance has to be to keep that small world intact. For the people on the island, these incidents are not accidents of navigation. They are tests. Each time a boat appears on their horizon, they are forced to decide again how hard they are willing to defend their boundaries. So far, their answer has been remarkably consistent. And in 2018, when a man came not by accident but by choice, believing he had a mission more important than their arrows, that answer would be on display for the entire world. In November 2018, that test came in its starkest form yet. The man who walked into their surf that month did not drift there on a broken engine or a shattered hull. He was not a fisherman pushed off course by a storm. He was a 26-year-old American named John Allen Chow, and he had been planning his journey for years. He believed deeply and sincerely that his God wanted him to bring Christianity to the Sentinelese. To him, North Sentinel wasn't a no-go zone. It was an unreached mission field. He flew into the Andamans like any other tourist. He stayed in a cheap guest house, he wrote in his journal. But behind those ordinary moves was a plan that ran directly against Indian law. Chow sought out local fishermen willing to take a risk for money. At night, under cover of darkness, their small boat carried him toward the invisible circle around North Sentinel that every government sign and chart said he was not allowed to cross. He knew all of that. He wasn't ignorant of the legal ban or the hostility of the islanders. His journals, later recovered, show a man acutely aware that he might die. He wrote about fear. He wrote about love. He wrote that he was willing to be killed if that was the cost of attempting what he saw as a divine mission. He left letters asking his family not to be angry at the islanders if he didn't come back. Just off the reef, the fishermen stopped. They would go no closer. Chow transferred to a kayak and paddled toward the line of breakers, carrying a waterproof Bible, some simple gifts, and a head full of phrases in a language no one had ever systematically recorded. The Sentinels, as they almost always do, saw him coming. What happened next can only be stitched together from his own brief notes, later accounts from the fishermen watching at a distance, and helicopter observations days later. There is no Sentinelese version that we can access. What we do know is that his first attempts at contact did not end in immediate violence. Island men reportedly shouted at him, shot an arrow that lodged in his Bible, then watched as he retreated. In his journal, he described them yelling, laughing, possibly mocking him. He also described himself singing worship songs and calling out English phrases about Jesus that they could not possibly understand. This could have been the end of the story. An intrusion rebuffed. A frightened but breathing outsider turning around and heading home. By his own account, he considered it. He wrote about the terror he felt. He wrote, "God, I don't want to die," then decided to push forward anyway. The next day he went back. This time he seems to have gone farther onto the beach. The fisherman who had ferried him to the edge of the exclusion zone watched from beyond bowshot, unable or unwilling to intervene. From that distance, you can see movement. You can see figures. You can see at a certain point that there is no more movement at all. They later told investigators they saw the islanders dragging his body along the sand and leaving it on the shore. When they slipped away and returned to Port Blair, they didn't bring Chow back. They brought a story. News of what had happened didn't explode instantly. For a brief window, it was just a grim briefing in a police station on a small archipelago. Local authorities had to absorb several brutal facts at once. A foreign national had illegally entered one of the most tightly controlled tribal reserves on Earth. He appeared to have been killed, and retrieving his body would require exactly the kind of high-risk contact their policies had been designed to prevent. They did what states do in such situations. They opened a case, interviewed the fishermen, seized evidence, informed consular officials. Teams were dispatched to the waters off North Sentinel, not as a rescue mission. Everyone agreed by then that there was nothing to rescue, but as an assessment. Could they get the body back? Should they even try? Helicopters flew over the beach. At one point, officers reported seeing a human figure, apparently buried in the sand with only part exposed, while islanders watched from the tree line, bows in hand. Boats edged in as far as they dared, loudspeakers were tested, ideas were floated, approach at night, send in a small, fast team at low tide, try to negotiate from the surf with gestures. Each plan ran into the same wall. Any attempt to land would mean close-range contact with a community that had violently repelled outsiders for generations and had no immunity to something as ordinary as a cold. It is hard to overstate how bitter that trade-off is for officials on the ground. On one side, the body of a young man whose family desperately wanted closure, whose passport made his death a matter of international interest, whose religious motives guaranteed scrutiny from powerful organizations. On the other side, the health and autonomy of fewer than 100 indigenous islanders who had never asked for any of this. In the end, Indian authorities made a choice that decades earlier would have seemed almost unimaginable. They stood down. After several cautious approaches, they announced that active efforts to recover Chow's remains would cease. The body, if that was indeed what the aerial photos showed, would stay where the Sentinelese left it. That decision sent a very clear signal. On paper, it lined up with existing policy. North Sentinel is legally off-limits. The Sentinelese are recognized as a protected tribe. Non-contact is the stated goal. In practice, it meant prioritizing their isolation over a dead foreigner's return. It meant telling a grieving family and a watching world that the rule of law and the desire for justice would not extend onto that strip of sand if enforcing them required violating the core principle that had kept the island's people alive. Do not go there. As the story finally did hit global media, the reaction was immediate and polarized. Headlines focused on the drama. Missionary killed by isolated tribe. Photos of Chow smiling on mountaintops and beaches were juxtaposed with stock images of a tiny dot of green in a blue sea. Social networks did what they always do. They turned a tragic, complicated event into a battleground of narratives. Some people, especially in certain missionary circles, framed Chow as a martyr. They spoke about courage, about sacrifice, about the biblical language he himself had used of the ends of the earth. They argued that the Sentinelese had been denied the chance to hear the gospel, and that his attempt, whatever its legal status, was an act of love. Others saw something very different. A man who had willfully broken Indian law, ignored repeated warnings, endangered a vulnerable population, and dragged local accomplices into criminal charges. To them, he was not a hero, but an intruder whose personal convictions did not give him the right to override hard-won protections for indigenous people. Then there were the voices in between, uncomfortable with both easy sainthood and easy condemnation. They pointed out that you can recognize Chow's sincerity and still criticize his choices. You can feel sorrow for his death while also understanding why the Sentinelese responded with force. You can even acknowledge that, from their perspective, they might not have seen a lone unarmed man spreading faith. They might have seen yet another stranger landing on their beach after a history of kidnappings, shootings, and disease. Accountability debates spilled in every direction. Should the fishermen who ferried him face prison time? They had, after all, knowingly helped him violate the exclusion zone, but they were also local men working under economic pressure, caught between a determined foreigner waving money and a legal regime that didn't always provide clear alternatives. Should Indian officials have done more to stop him before he set out? Reports later surfaced that he had been warned multiple times. Laws were already on the books. At what point does a state become responsible for saving people from their own deliberate risk-taking? And then there is the question almost no one can answer cleanly. Should the Sentinelese themselves bear any moral or legal blame? In most jurisdictions, killing an unarmed person is homicide. Yet here, the killer or killers will never be arrested, never stand trial, never even know that a trial was theoretically on the table. The Indian government made it plain from the start that no punitive expedition would be launched, no quiet snatch and grab in the night. The Islanders Act was treated not as a crime to be punished, but as an extension of their long-standing refusal of contact. That stance hardened something that had been emerging for decades, a global, if fragile, consensus that some groups have the right to be left alone. Indigenous organisations from South America to Australia weighed in, many of them defending both the non-recovery decision and the Sentinelese response. They saw in Chow's story a familiar pattern. Outsiders convinced they knew what was best for people whose histories they barely understood, and a rare instance of a state actually holding the line in favour of isolation. In anthropology circles, the case became a grim case study. It crystallised arguments that had been playing out for years. Should uncontacted peoples be gently brought into the global system for their own good? Or should their wish for distance be honoured even when it leads to painful, unresolved endings like a body left on a beach? Chow's death, and the decision not to retrieve him, shifted the balance of that debate toward non-contact. It became the example people cited when arguing that respecting autonomy sometimes means accepting outcomes that feel deeply wrong on an individual human level. At the same time, the event poured fuel on the old persistent question at the heart of this entire story. Why do the Sentinelese respond the way they do? Each arrow, each shouted warning, each dead outsider is easy to label as hostility or savagery from a distance. But those words hide more than they reveal. Some observers leaned on the simplest framing. They're violent because they are primitive, untouched by modern norms. That view is both scientifically weak and ethically lazy. Violence around boundaries is not unique to small isolated groups. Nations with satellite surveillance and nuclear weapons do exactly the same thing at their frontiers, just with more paperwork and bigger tools. Others pointed to the long arc of their contact history, the kidnappings and disease introductions under British colonial expeditions, the rumoured shootings by poachers and fishermen, the constant low-level harassment of boats nosing toward their reefs. Seen against that backdrop, the killing in 2018 looks less like random aggression and more like the continuation of a policy. No strangers on the beach, ever. When someone crosses that line voluntarily, after warnings and clear signals, the response is consistent with how they have treated intrusions for as long as we have records. But even this explanation, grounded in history and strategy, is still a story we tell from the outside. Inside the island's social world, their reasons might be framed through myth, memory, or categories we don't have. They may understand outsiders as spirits, as dangerous animals, as members of a rival human group. They may have rules about contact that we would recognize as law, but which have never been written down. We do not know. We cannot know without doing the very thing almost everyone now agrees we should avoid, going in, asking, and in the process changing everything. What Chow's death did, more than anything, was slam that paradox into public view. Here was a man crossing the water not by accident but by design, convinced that his message outweighed their boundaries. Here was a community responding exactly as they had to shipwrecked strangers and stray fishers, with arrows and exclusion. And here was a modern state choosing, after the fact, not to override that response with helicopters and guns in the name of law, religion or closure. In that sense, the 2018 killing didn't reveal a new Sentinelese why. It underlined the one we'd already seen, again and again, if we were willing to look. They defend the edge of their world absolutely. The rest of us, watching from satellites, ships and screens, are left to argue about what that defence means, and how close we're willing to come to testing it again. When people talk about the Sentinelese, the question comes up fast and blunt. Why do they kill? Anthropologists tend to flinch at that framing, not because it's offensive, but because it sneaks in an assumption that their behaviour is some kind of raw, instinctive violence, a glitch in the human program that needs an explanation. If you zoom out even a little, it starts to look less like a mystery and more like a policy. The island has a border. The border is enforced. Cross it, and you may die. That still leaves the harder question. How did that policy become so absolute? Why does it hold so tightly that even a lone man singing out of tune in a kayak doesn't get treated as an exception? One place to start is with memory, not individual memory. Most of the people who lived through the first colonial encounters are long gone, but what you could call trauma memory, passed down through stories, taboos, and rules. We know that in the late 19th century, British officials and researchers captured Sentinelese people. They took adults and children off the island. Some of those captives died quickly, likely from diseases their immune systems had never seen. Others were taken back, left on the shore with strange clothes, unfamiliar objects, and maybe the bodies of relatives who hadn't survived the trip. You don't need a written language to turn that into a lesson. You need only one clear pattern. Strangers arrive, people disappear, people die. Outsiders bring sickness, abduction, loss. Over time, that experience can harden into something more than a vague sense of danger. It becomes a rule about how the world works. Every society does this. A village that loses children to a certain river at a certain season may tell stories about a water spirit that drags the unwary under. A community that suffers invasion might create rituals and taboos around watching the horizon, never leaving weapons far from reach. On North Sentinel, the rule might be simpler and colder. Do not let them land. If you grow up hearing that your grandparents were taken by men from the sea, that they returned sick, or didn't return at all, you don't see a drifting fishing boat as neutral. You see a repeating threat pattern. Trauma becomes taught behaviour. Over generations, it stops feeling like a response and starts feeling like tradition. But even that isn't the whole story, because the Sentinels don't just react with fear. They react with what looks from the outside very much like strategy. North Sentinel is small, a tiny speck of land, a ring of reef, a narrow strip of forest and beach. Unlike some other Andaman groups, the Sentinelese don't have multiple islands to move between. Their resource base is finite. The number of people it can support is probably small. In that kind of closed system, territorial survival isn't a philosophical concept, it's math. If your population is only a few dozen or a few score, the margin for error is razor thin. A new disease that kills 10 adults is not just a tragedy. It's a demographic landslide. A handful of outsiders who decide to stay and help could double the number of mouths to feed in a single season. A permanent fishing camp on your reef could strip out protein you rely on. You don't need calculators or spreadsheets to grasp that. You just need to notice that too many strangers staying too long means less for your own children. Anthropologists who study small-scale societies talk about the logic of deterrence in very familiar terms because it echoes state behaviour. If you make the cost of trespassing high enough, early enough, you reduce the chance that anyone will push farther in. That's not cruelty. That's boundary management. From that angle, the arrows on the beach aren't random eruptions of temper. They are the sharp end of a long-term survival strategy. Make sure the outside world understands that this coastline is not negotiable. Turn the island into a place with a reputation, a no-go zone enforced not by written law, but by stories of what happens if you ignore the warnings. In a strange way, this is also a form of communication. Violence becomes a signal. Think about how governments use border fences, patrols, even occasional force. The goal is not just to stop this one crossing. The goal is to shape the behaviour of everyone who might think of crossing in the future. The Sentinelese don't have fences or radar. What they do have is a track record. Poachers shot at, sometimes killed, helicopters met with volleys of arrows, wrecked fishermen attacked when they tried to approach the interior. A missionary who keeps coming back despite warnings finally stopped with finality. Each of those events carries a message far beyond the island. Word spreads among local fishers, don't go near that reef. It spreads among officials and pilots and eventually global media. North Sentinel becomes that place. The place where you don't land, don't explore, don't try your luck. The place that will make you an example if you test it. If you were designing a deterrent strategy on purpose, with no interest in diplomacy, you could hardly do better. First, make your red line obvious: shoreline, boats, low-flying machines. Second, respond fast. Third, respond disproportionately enough that no one mistakes your intent. From then on, you barely have to act. The reputation does a lot of the work for you. Of course, none of this means the Sentinelese are sitting around having abstract discussions about deterrence theory. It just means their repeated choices line up very neatly with the logic of making outsiders stay away. There's another layer here that's less about intention and more about miscommunication. When an anthropologist or a Coast Guard officer talks about approaching carefully, they mean something specific: slow movements, open hands, gifts, perhaps repeated visits with gradually decreasing distance. In their own mental model, this is gentle, non-threatening, practically polite. Now flip the camera. You're standing on a beach you and your ancestors have defended for as long as anyone can remember. Out on the water you see a shape moving toward you. It doesn't move like a log or a turtle. It moves with purpose. Sometimes it has a loud roaring noise. Sometimes it glitters in the sun. Sometimes, as with Chow's kayak, it's small and quiet, but it's still a human coming closer despite being shouted at, despite arrows in the air. If your only historical experience of boats approaching your shore involves abduction, shooting, or epidemics, what does slow and cautious look like from your side? It might look like people lining up to take you. An outstretched hand might read not as gift, but as grab. Even the calmest drift into the shallows could map, in your cultural categories, onto raid. This is miscommunication at the most basic possible level. Not just different languages, but different assumptions about what actions mean. A helicopter hovering at what pilots consider a respectful distance might be experienced as a giant screaming bird threatening the canopy. A patrol boat idling just outside the surf might feel like an enemy force staging in your front yard. In that context, loosing arrows is less a surprising escalation and more a natural response to what everyone on the island has been taught. When danger appears at the limit of your world, don't wait to see how polite it is. Drive it back. Then there's the puzzle of trade and gifts. Modern states and NGOs often treat trading as a neutral good. Offer tools, cloth, food. If the other side accepts, it's seen as a foot in the door. If they refuse, try again later, maybe with a different selection. The Sentinelese have mostly refused. There are accounts of them taking coconuts dropped by the Indian authorities in the 1970s and 80s. At other times, they have ignored or shot at gifts left on the beach. They have occasionally grabbed metal or buckets and then melted back into the trees. But they have never allowed anything resembling a sustained exchange relationship to develop. They do not meet regular contact parties with the predictable rhythm seen among some neighbouring tribes. They do not barter. They do not signal desire for specific goods. One interpretation is that they are simply uninterested, but another is that they understand, perhaps better than many would like to admit, what trade tends to bring in its wake: dependency. Once you get used to iron tools you can't make yourself, you're one broken supply chain away from disaster. Once you rely on imported food during a lean season, you've given outsiders leverage over your hunger. History across the Andaman Islands and elsewhere is full of examples where friendly trade slowly turned into reliance, then into domination. Gifts become hooks. Helpful visitors become managers of your survival. Seen against that background, refusing trade is a radical act of autonomy. It's a way of saying, we will not owe you. We will not rearrange our lives around your goods. If the price of that independence is forgoing metal, cloth, and sweet factory foods, it might be a price they have decided is worth paying. And if trade is refused, then approach itself becomes suspect. What are you doing here, if not selling something we don't want or taking something we do? Finally, there are the triggers that might turn a tense watch into an immediate release of arrows: the environment itself. Anyone who has lived in a forest or on a small island knows that sound carries, and that unusual noise is often the first sign of danger. For the Sentinelese, the normal soundscape is wind, surf, birds, their own tools and voices. Against that background, the thump of helicopter rotors or the harsh engine of a fiberglass hull is not just modern technology. It is a loud, alien intrusion. Some researchers who have watched from a distance have noted that the islanders often appear first on the beach when something noisy approaches. They do not wait for it to arrive silently. They seem to be keying on sound and movement, the rhythm of paddles, the shape of a hull cutting across known fishing grounds, the sudden shadow of a low-flying aircraft. These may be the cues that flip them from everyday activity into defensive posture. Rapid, unfamiliar motion can have the same effect. A small group of shipwrecked men stumbling along the shore, waving and shouting in panic, might be read as attackers mustering. A single figure walking straight toward the tree line without hesitation might be read as someone trying to penetrate the interior. From our side we see distress, confusion, maybe plea for help. From theirs, those same gestures might slot neatly into a pattern labelled invasion. This is one reason why even well-meaning rescue attempts are dangerous. The more urgent the outsider's movements, the more they might look in Sentinelese eyes, like the prelude to capture or violence. In those split seconds there is no time to decode intent. There is only time to act according to the rules you've been given. None of these theories, trauma memory, territorial logic, deterrent signalling, miscommunication, resistance to dependency, environmental triggers, has to be the single, perfect explanation. Human behavior rarely has one. They can all be true at once, layering over each other inside a culture we can't directly enter. Inside the island's own stories, those layers might not be separated at all. There might simply be a set of tales about the people of the sea and the disasters that followed them, a series of prohibitions about letting them land, and a clear expectation that every adult participates in enforcing that boundary. In that world, picking up a bow when you see a boat is not a philosophical statement. It is what responsible people do. From the outside, we give that bundle of habits and histories a name. They attack. From the inside, it may feel less like aggression and more like duty. What we can say with some confidence is that their behavior is not random. It is not inexplicable. It fits patterns we see across human societies when small, vulnerable groups face larger, intrusive ones with a record of doing harm. The Sentinelese have simply pushed the logic of resistance as far as it can go. No landing, no trade, no negotiation, no exceptions. Which raises a final uncomfortable question for everyone watching. If their reasons, whatever exact form they take, are rooted in survival and autonomy, what does that imply about our own reasons for wanting to get closer anyway? We like to think that to understand something, we have to get close to it. Closer, closer, until we're face to face, shaking hands, taking samples, asking questions, recording answers. North Sentinel Island forces us to test a different idea. How much can you learn while staying exactly where you're not wanted? It turns out quite a lot, and also not nearly as much as most people are comfortable with. Start with the obvious tools, eyes at a distance. Indian authorities, researchers, and passing ships have spent decades doing what you might call respectful snooping, watching from boats anchored beyond bow range, flying over high enough that arrows can't touch a helicopter's hull, pointing cameras with long lenses at the narrow fringe of beach where forest, sand and surf meet. From that, a few basic facts emerge. We can estimate within wide margins how many people live there. Some counts suggest a few dozen. Others, taken years apart, suggest maybe a low few hundred. Enough to form a small society, not enough to absorb many shocks. We can see that they use canoes, but not in the way you might expect. Sentinelese craft are often pushed along inside the lagoon, not taken far out into open water. That hints at a pattern of reef-based fishing and foraging, a life oriented toward the shallow familiar circle around the island rather than the deep ocean beyond. We see bodies, short to medium height, dark skin, strong builds. We see thatched shelters. We see fires burning under tree cover, which tells us they have long mastered fire in a humid, rain-prone environment where keeping embers alive is not trivial. We see evidence of metal use, even though they do not forge their own iron. They are skilled at scavenging from shipwrecks, reshaping the modern world's garbage into knives, spearheads and tools. From satellite imagery and aerial surveys, we can sketch the island's shape with frightening precision. We can map the lagoons, the reefs, the mangroves, the bands of forest. We can track how the shoreline shifts after storms. We can see indirectly where people are active, paths in the undergrowth, clearings that weren't there decades ago, the pattern of huts appearing and disappearing over time. Ecologists can analyse the reef and nearby waters without setting foot on the island. They can estimate fish populations, coral health, the presence of sea turtles. From that they can infer something about the Sentinelese diet. Archaeologists can study currents and wreck records and say, with some confidence, that the people on North Sentinel have access to a steady, if unpredictable, supply of iron and other modern materials, washing up from the disasters of navigation around them. On paper, this starts to look like knowledge. Numbers, maps, typed reports. But notice what's missing. We don't know their language family. We don't know their myths, their names for the birds or the currents, their categories for us and them. We don't know their kinship system, who is allowed to marry whom, how they define cousin, sibling, elder. We don't know their music, their jokes, their taboos about food or sex or death. We don't know what they would tell their children about the first time strangers came with guns, or about the ghost of a grandmother who never returned from a trip across the water. Distant observation is powerful at answering questions like, how many huts did we see on this beach in February? It is almost useless at answering, what does this gesture mean? What does that ritual do? What does this decision feel like from the inside? And yet, that limitation is not an argument for pushing closer. It's a reminder that understanding has layers, and not all of them are ours to dig up. This is where the second part comes in. Accepting that curiosity does not equal entitlement. There's a quiet assumption baked into a lot of talk about the Sentinelese. It sounds reasonable on the surface. We just want to understand them. But dig a little, and you find a whole bundle of unstated claims. That our desire to know is noble, that our methods of knowing are neutral, that if we approach carefully, if we label our motives as scientific or humanitarian, the moral weight tilts toward contact being acceptable. North Sentinel pushes back on that by existing as a permanent no. The Sentinelese have not filled out consent forms. They have not sat on panels to debate pros and cons. They have done something older and more direct. They have pointed arrows at every attempt to cross a certain invisible line and, when necessary, loosed them. You can interpret that signal. If a person bars their door, you don't get to claim that you're owed entry because you're a doctor, or a filmmaker, or someone who just really wants to see what the inside looks like. Respecting their boundary isn't conditional on you understanding why they drew it. With the Sentinelese, we know enough to recognize the stakes. We know that contact has killed isolated communities again and again through disease. We know that even careful, planned, controlled encounters have a track record of unintended consequences, dependency, cultural disruption, trauma. We know that they have said no, in the clearest language they have, resistance at the shore. Under those conditions, continuing to approach isn't neutral curiosity. It's a refusal to accept that some kinds of knowledge come with a price tag, We don't have the right to pay on someone else's behalf. That doesn't mean we do nothing. It means we shift from asking, how can we reach them, to how can we not reach them in ways that still do harm? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Even without contact, the modern world can hurt them. India has, on paper, some of the strictest protection measures on Earth for North Sentinel. The island and a buffer of surrounding waters are officially off limits. No tourism, no filming permits, no scientific expeditions, no last uncontacted tribe cruise packages where you sip cocktails on a deck and point telephoto lenses at the shoreline. But lines on maps are only as strong as the forces pushing against them. Poachers still slip into the Andaman waters, hunting sea cucumbers, fish and turtles. Some of them stray into the Sentinelese buffer, chasing profit into forbidden zones. When they do, they bring not only the risk of direct confrontation, but also of introducing pathogens via the sea, via shared fish stocks, via the simple fact of physically overlapping ecosystems. Illegal fishing boats sometimes anchor closer than they should, especially at night, when enforcement is thin and fuel is expensive. A wrecked trawler on the reef is not just a hazard for the poachers, it's another unwanted portal between two worlds, another chance encounter between desperate men and a community that has made its opposition clear. Tourism pressures rise and fall with global trends. Every time a sensational article or documentary about the last uncontacted tribe goes viral, operators feel the pull. Could we get close enough for a glimpse, for a shot worth selling? Even if only 1 in 1,000 acts on that impulse, it's one more boat edging in, confident that just a few minutes can't hurt. And then there are the small frictions of state presence. Patrols, enforcement, the occasional helicopter check after a cyclone to make sure the island hasn't been completely destroyed. These actions are meant to protect, but they also risk becoming their own form of pressure. Fly over too often, hover too low, and you're not just watching, you're intruding. So protection is not a single decision you make once. It's a continuous practice in a world that is always looking for new ways to extract value. Fish, novelty, stories, proof that you were the first to do something no one asked you to do. In that sense, North Sentinel isn't just an anthropological curiosity. It's a stress test of whether modern systems can actually leave something alone once they've noticed it. Zoom out even farther and the island starts to look like a collision point between two timescales. On one side, you have modernity. Satellite tracking, Coast Guard cutters, viral videos, international NGOs, and 1 billion people with cameras in their pockets. A world that moves at the speed of news cycles and stock markets, where the default assumption is that everything can eventually be integrated into the network, as a tourist site, a subject of study, a story beat in a content stream. On the other side, you have a community whose way of life represents something like deep time independence. The Sentinelese are not primitive in the sense of being stuck in the past. Their present is as current as anyone's. But their core social logic, small group, self-sufficient, minimally entangled with outside institutions, bears the imprint of a human pattern that long predates agriculture, writing, states. We often talk about uncontacted tribes as if they are unfinished projects waiting to be upgraded. North Sentinel flips that script. It raises a heretical possibility. Maybe the direction of history is not a straight line from isolation to integration, and maybe not everyone wants or needs to get on the same track. Seen that way, the island is less a blank spot on our map and more a mirror held up to our own assumptions. It doesn't just make us ask what their world is like. It makes us ask why ours seem so incapable of tolerating places that don't want to plug in. That's one of the most useful shifts we can make, away from why are they violent and toward why do we keep going there. Think about how the question usually gets framed. The Sentinels attack boats. They kill intruders. They shoot at helicopters. The violence is attached to them, as if we're watching a storm that happened to form over this particular reef. But no arrow flies in a vacuum. Every volley requires a target, and in this story that target is almost always an outsider who chose to get closer after being told, in lore and in legend, to stay away. Why, then, is the behaviour that triggers the arrows, the approach, so rarely put under the same microscope? Part of it is simple drama. Hostile tribe kills missionary makes an easy headline. Modern man ignores repeated warnings, enters prohibited zone, is stopped by people enforcing their boundary, is less catchy. It starts to sound like workplace safety training. Don't cross the line where the forklift operates. Part of it is older and uglier, the lingering belief that the world is by default open to us, that remote places are waiting to be visited, that hidden societies are there to be revealed. When someone resists that script, we frame it as a mystery in need of solving instead of a decision in need of respecting. And part of it is discomfort. It's easier to ask what's wrong with the Sentinels than to ask what it says about us that even an island with explicit legal protection, a history of deadly encounters, and crystal-clear signals from its inhabitants still attracts would-be saviours, adventurers, and curiosity tourists. Reframing the mystery doesn't mean we stop wondering about the Sentinelese. It means we redirect some of that wonder back at ourselves. Why does the idea of a place we will never know in detail bother us so much? Why do we find it so hard to accept that our categories, progress, contact, development, evangelism, documentation, might simply not apply in a way that grants us action rights? What North Sentinel quietly offers, if we let it, is a different lesson in knowledge. That sometimes the most ethical thing we can learn is where to stop. We can learn that a society can exercise agency without filling out forms, simply by defending its coast. We can learn that modern states, if they choose, can codify that choice and use their power not to penetrate but to shield. We can learn that our tools, satellites, drones, long lenses, are capable of both curiosity and restraint. We can see enough to avoid harm without insisting on seeing everything. We can also learn to live with an unfinished story, to accept that there are human lives unfolding right now in parallel with ours, about which we will never have biographies, ethnographies, or Instagram posts. Lives whose worth doesn't depend on our ability to narrate them. In an age where everything is tracked, shared, and monetized, that might be the rarest lesson of all, that there can still be a shore you do not land on, a people you do not meet, and that your ignorance of their specifics is not a flaw to be corrected, but a boundary to be honoured. So where does that leave us? We began with what sounded like a simple set of questions. Who are the Sentinelese? How long have they been there? Why do they react with such force to anyone who comes near? Across a century and a half of ship logs, government records, satellite images, and a handful of disastrous encounters, we've managed to sketch a loose outline. We can say, with cautious confidence, that they are likely descendants of people who reached these islands tens of thousands of years ago, maybe riding the same post-Ice Age migrations that spread humans along the coasts of Asia. We can say they've probably seen slavers, colonial gunboats, warships, fishing trawlers, and helicopters pass within sight of their beaches. We can point to that long pattern of threat and intrusion and say, this might help explain the arrows. But notice how every sentence like that quietly leans on words like likely, probably, might. The record lets us narrow possibilities, not arrive at certainty. Genetics from neighbouring groups can hint at deep ancestry, but not map individual family lines on North Sentinel. Old maps can show where British officers thought they saw huts in 1890, but not what stories the people in those huts told about the encounter. A floating corpse on a beach in 2006 or 2018 can tell us that a line was crossed. It cannot tell us what was said over the next few nights around the fire. There's a temptation, especially in an age that runs on data, to treat every blank as a challenge. If you can see the island from orbit, if you can count the huts and estimate the fish stocks and model the cyclone risk, then surely, with just a bit more effort, you could fill in the rest. Language, ritual, history, motivation. But this is where North Sentinel forces a different kind of answer. Sometimes the most responsible conclusion is we don't know, and we should not try to know more. Not because the questions aren't interesting, they are. Anthropologists would love to understand how a small group maintains social cohesion over centuries in the same confined space. Linguists would be fascinated by a language that has evolved in such extreme isolation. Historians would give a great deal to hear an oral tradition that may remember slavers as sea demons or the reg as a storm that came and went. We could, in theory, learn all that at a cost. That cost would not be paid by us. It would be paid by people who have already signalled clearly and repeatedly that they do not wish to enter into that bargain. That's the uncomfortable pivot, from mystery as puzzle to mystery as boundary. The first invites you to pry. The second asks you to stop. Accepting that is not the same as romanticising the Sentinelese. They are not mascots of purity or stand-ins for some imagined Stone Age. They are a living community, with all the complexity that implies. They have disagreements, alliances, griefs, rivalries, moments of joy that have nothing to do with us. They are not frozen in time. They adapt to storms, to changing currents, to metal washing up on their reef instead of only driftwood and bone. What makes them unusual is not that they are ancient, it's that they are one of the very few human societies still able to enforce a hard line around their home, and have that line, however imperfectly, backed up by a modern state. Strip away the headlines and the core reality looks almost simple. A community lives on an island. Outsiders keep arriving, and the history of those arrivals ranges from slavery to kidnapping, to friendly contact that carried invisible plagues. So the community learns. Anyone who comes too close is a potential existential threat. They respond with the tools they have: bows, spears, warning shots that sometimes become lethal shots. From their side of the surf, they are not an enigma. They are people defending their home. We are the ones making it into a riddle. We are the ones asking over and over, but why don't they want what we're offering? Why don't they want medicine or Jesus or globalization or the chance to be on camera? Why don't they trust that this time, unlike all the previous times, the strangers mean well? At a certain point, insisting on an answer to that why becomes its own kind of refusal to listen. It assumes that the only legitimate boundary is one we can decode and respect on our terms, with reasons we find persuasive. But boundaries don't have to pass our test to be real. They only have to be enforced. So one way to solve the mystery of the Sentinelese is to turn the question around. Instead of asking what is wrong with them, ask why it is so hard for modern systems, states, markets, churches, media, even scientific institutions, to live with a pocket of deliberate opacity. Why is it so intolerable that there are humans we will never know in detail? Why does uncontacted so quickly morph in our minds into unfinished business? Living with that discomfort is part of the ethical homework this island assigns us. It means accepting that some of the most basic human questions — what songs do they sing? What do they teach their children about the stars? What name do they have for themselves? — may never be answered for us, and that this is not a tragedy to be averted, but a choice to be respected. That doesn't mean shutting our eyes and walking away. It means reorienting what learning more looks like. We can study how diseases travel, so that shipwrecks and illegal boats are less likely to wipe out a population that has never been exposed to influenza or measles. We can study how legal protections fail, so that enforcement around North Sentinel doesn't evaporate every time budgets tighten or headlines move on. We can examine our own reflexes, the urge to visit, to film, to convert, to help, and ask where they come from and who they really serve. In other words, we can let the mystery stay intact at its centre while working, on our side of the water, to minimise the damage caused by our curiosity and our proximity. If we do that well, the Sentinelese will go on doing what their ancestors have done for generations, waking up to the sound of surf and wind in the trees, tracking the seasons by the feel of the air, raising children who will never know, in any detailed way, how obsessed distant strangers once were with their existence. And we, paradoxically, may be better for never having had our questions answered. In a world that flattens everything into content and access and transparency, it's healthy to be reminded that some doors stay closed, that not all stories are ours to tell. That part of being a good neighbour even across an invisible maritime buffer, is to acknowledge the right of the people on the other side to remain in many ways unknown. If you've stayed with this story all the way to this point, you're probably someone who likes sitting with big, unsettling questions. If you want to go even deeper into how ancient crises and hidden histories have shaped who we are today, I've put a lot of that into a book about our species' prehistoric secrets. The bottlenecks, near extinctions, and strange turns that made us human. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you'd like to support this kind of storytelling over at sleepytimehistory.com. And if you found this exploration of North Sentinel thought-provoking, take a moment to help it travel a bit farther without anyone having to cross a forbidden shoreline. Tap like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'm always curious how these stories ripple out across the world. Somewhere, right now, waves are breaking on a beach you and I will never walk, in front of people we will never meet. Their lives will go on without our cameras, without our questions, without our approval. Leaving that mystery intact might be one of the few real gifts we can still offer.